The high plains sun hammered Sagebrush Crossing into submission by 4 in the afternoon. It was not just heat, it was a physical weight, smelling of baked alkali and dry manure. The wind, when it bothered to move, did nothing but shift the fine red dust from the street onto the boardwalk, coating every surface in a gritty, ochre film. Inside the cedar-traced trading post, the air was thick, heavy with the competing scents of cured tobacco, molasses, rifle oil, and sharp lye soap. Delilah Quinn stood at the counter, her hands clenched so tightly around a bolt of cheap calico that her knuckles were white. The fabric was thin, the blue dye already looking faded, but it was the only thing standing between her aunt's ailing skin and the horsehair mattress that rubbed it raw. Across the worn plank counter, Prudence Banner watched her. Prudence was a woman built like the barrels she sold solid, banded in iron, and completely unyielding. Her eyes, small and dark, missed nothing. Her fingers drummed the worn leather cover of the heavy ledger that sat open between them. Well, Prudence's voice was as dry as the dust outside. "It is $2.40 for the cloth, and the ledger already shows you $5 and change deep. That's for the laudanum last week, and the bandages before that." Near the doorway, clustered around the pickle barrel, sat 3 men from the Union Pacific crew. They were caked in sweat and grime, their laughter loud and coarse, filling the store with the sour smell of cheap whiskey. They had stopped talking when Prudence raised her voice, turning their attention to the small drama at the counter. In a town this dry, entertainment was scarce. "I will have the money," Delilah whispered, her voice cracking with the effort of keeping it steady. "Payday for the mending I did at the saloon is Friday. I swear it, Mrs. Banner." Prudence let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Friday. It is always Friday. Is it not? Your credit is done here. Delilah, this establishment is a business, not a charity." One of the railroad men snorted, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Hear that, boys? She's done." He spat a stream of tobacco juice toward the brass spittoon and missed, the dark liquid staining the floorboards. "Maybe she can offer another kind of payment." The other 2 men laughed. They were raw, ugly sounds that scraped against Delilah's nerves. Her face burned. It was a heat far worse than the high plains sun. She felt the weight of their eyes on her back, assessing her worn boots, the frayed cuffs of her gray dress, the thinness of her waist. She was not just poor, she was a public spectacle. The $2.40 felt like $200. It was the laudanum that broke her. Aunt Elspeth needed it. The dampness in her hip joint, a relic of a winter fall, had turned vicious. The nights were the worst, filled with the sound of her aunt staring at the ceiling, grinding her teeth against the pain. Without the medicine, the pain made her keen like a wounded animal, a sound Delilah could not bear. Delilah fumbled in her pocket for her handkerchief. It was an old square of linen, worn nearly transparent from 100 washings. It was already damp, not with tears yet, but with the perspiration that had gathered on her palms and neck all day. She pressed it to her eyes, and the fabric came away stained with the red dust she had tried to wipe from her face earlier. It smelled of alkali and shame. The tears threatened, hot and thick, blurring the stacked bolts of fabric and the hanging harnesses. She would not cry. Not here, not in front of them. She swallowed, the knot in her throat feeling like a twist of barbed wire. He had been in the store for perhaps 5 minutes, standing back by the sacks of grain, smelling the oats, waiting his turn. Holden Pike moved with a stillness that made him easy to overlook. He was a tall man, made taller by silence. He had come down from Juniper Flats for salt licks and coffee. His duster was canvas, worn pale at the elbows and smelling faintly of horse and pine. His boots were caked with the dark, heavy mud of the high country spring thaw, a stark contrast to the red dust that choked the town. He watched. He saw the tremor in Delilah's hands, the way her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. He saw the speculative, ugly looks from the railroad crew. He saw the rigid satisfaction in Prudence Banner's posture. Holden Pike knew loneliness. It was the air he breathed up on the flats. It was the empty chair across his table. It was the sound of one man's footsteps on a wooden floor, day after day. What he was seeing in Delilah Quinn was different. This was not loneliness. This was humiliation. This was being flayed, piece by piece, in public. Prudence grabbed the bolt of calico from Delilah's grip. If you cannot pay, you cannot have. Simple as that. She prepared to put it back on the shelf. "I need it," Delilah pleaded, the whisper tearing from her. "Please." "Everybody needs something." Prudence dipped her pen in the inkwell, her movements sharp and angry. She opened her ledger, finding the page with Quinn scrawled at the top. She picked up the heavy brass stamp, the one that said "Account overdue," in severe letters, and pressed it hard onto the ink pad. She raised it high, relishing the moment, aiming for the empty space below the $5 debt. Just as she brought it down, a shadow fell over the page. A hand, broad and scarred, appeared on the counter. It was not a clean hand. Dirt was ingrained in the lines of the palm and under the nails. It was the hand of a man who worked hard with wire and wood. A silver dollar landed on the worn wood of the counter. It did not jingle. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. Holden Pike moved from the shadows, stepping beside Delilah. He did not look at her. He did not look at the railroad men. He looked directly at Prudence Banner. The overdue stamp hit the ledger, but the sound was muffled by the presence of the coin. Holden retrieved the calico bolt from Prudence's slackened grip and placed it gently back in Delilah's arms. He slid the coin toward the proprietor. "That should cover her," he said. His voice was low, rough, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "And the laudanum. Whatever is left, put it against her name for next time." Prudence Banner stared at the coin, then at Holden. Her gaze was sharp, calculating. She knew Holden Pike. Everyone in the valley knew him. The man who had lost everything to a barn fire up on the Flats' wife, child, everything but the land itself. The man who had not spoken more than 10 words in town in 3 years. She swept the coin into her palm and tossed a few smaller coins back onto the counter as change. "Well, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice dripping with implication. "Feeling charitable or just lonely?" She leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to be insulting, but loud enough for the railroad men to hear. "It is your silver, but you are paying for a troubled girl, one who cannot hold on to a man or her money." The railroad men snickered. Hearing the edge in her tone, Delilah flinched, the words striking harder than a slap. Troubled. That was the word the town used. It was the word the preacher's son, Amos Crow, had used. Troubled meant broken, used up, pitied. Holden Pike did not raise his voice. He did not move. He simply held Prudence's gaze. "She ain't trouble." He said it quiet, but the words cut through the dusty air. It was not a defense. It was a statement of fact, as solid as the coin he had dropped. Prudence's smirk faltered. There was something in Pike's eyes, a flat, cold stillness that made her look away first. She busied herself bagging his coffee and salt, her movements suddenly jerky. Delilah was vibrating, her legs weak. She wanted to run, to drop the fabric and flee. She turned to the tall rancher, her face a mask of confusion and burning shame. Holden Pike finally looked at her. His eyes were gray, the color of a winter sky, and weathered at the corners from squinting into the sun. They held an exhaustion she recognized. He saw the way she was clutching the calico, her knuckles white. He saw the tear that had finally escaped, tracking a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He leaned down, just slightly. The railroad men were watching. Prudence was watching. He did not care. He brought his mouth close to her ear, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of pine and cold air that clung to him. He whispered. The words meant only for her, a rumble so low it was more vibration than sound. "You ain't a bill to be settled." The words landed inside her. It was as if a tightly wound spring in her chest, a spring she had not even known was there, suddenly snapped. The breath she had been holding rushed out of her in a ragged sob she tried desperately to stifle. It was not just the money. It was that he had seen her, not the debt, not the rumor, not the troubled girl, but the person drowning underneath. The moment of quiet intimacy was broken by the railroad men. Well, looks like Pike found himself a stray," one of them muttered, loud enough to carry. The one who had spat on the floor stood up, hitching his trousers. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder, with a cruel twist to his mouth. He looked Delilah up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Careful, rancher," the man said, his voice greasy with insinuation. "You pay for goods like that. You ought to check 'em first. Make sure they ain't damaged." Delilah froze, the insult clear and vile, turning her blood to ice. Holden Pike did not tense. He did not reach for the pistol holstered high on his hip. He did not say a word. He just turned his head, slow. He looked at the man. It was a look devoid of anger. It was colder than that. It was the flat, dead-eyed gaze of a man who had already seen the worst the world could do and had nothing left to lose. It was the look of the winter sky over an empty grave. It held no threat, only an absolute, bottomless finality. The big man's smirk wavered. He suddenly found the grain sacks by the wall fascinating. He looked away, shifted his feet. The silence in the store became thick, heavy, suffocating. The buzzing of a fly trapped against the window pane sounded like a roar. The man cleared his throat and sat back down, abruptly finding his pickle barrel far more interesting. The laughter was gone. The noise died. The tension broken. Delilah fumbled in her pocket again, pulling out the few coins she possessed. A nickel and 3 pennies. It was everything she had until Friday. "Sir, I must—" She pushed the coins toward him, her hands shaking so badly they rattled against her palm. "I cannot accept. Please, this is—" Holden looked at the coins. He looked at her desperate, proud, shattered face. He gently, almost impersonally, put his hand over hers, stopping the offering. His palm was rough, the calluses like worn leather, but his touch was surprisingly light. "Not now," he said, his voice still low. He pushed her hand, and the coins, back toward her pocket. "But I must repay you," she insisted, the shame of charity warring with the relief of it. "I will not be a charity case." Holden picked up his own sacks of coffee and salt, balancing them easily on one shoulder. He looked at her one last time, a flicker of something not pity, never pity, maybe understanding in his gray eyes. "Later," he said, "repay it later. With something kind, the world needs more of that." He turned and walked out of the store. The bells on the door jangled softly. He left the scent of pine and the echo of his words behind. Delilah stood there for a second, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clutched the calico and her few coins. The railroad men were silent. Prudence was already scrubbing the counter where the coin had lain, her face sour. Delilah fled. She burst through the door into the blinding red sunlight, gulping the hot, dusty air as if it were clean. She nearly collided with the man leaning against the veranda post. Deputy Clayton Voss. Voss was a man who enjoyed his uniform. He kept it brushed, his boots polished to a high shine, his badge gleaming. It gave him an authority his thin frame and weasel-like face did not naturally command. He worked for the county, but everyone knew his paycheck was guaranteed by Ephraim Calder, the landowner who was slowly squeezing the life out of the small ranchers in the valley. Voss held a small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil. He had been watching the entire exchange through the dusty window. He did not move to let her pass. He just looked at her, a faint, unpleasant smile on his lips. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice smooth and thin as oil. Delilah stopped, her escape cut off. "Deputy!" He tapped the pencil against the notebook. causing a scene at the trading post. That is twice this month I have heard shouting when you are around." "I was not shouting," Delilah protested, her voice weak. It was a misunderstanding. Mrs. Banner and I—" "Seems like misunderstandings follow you," Voss said. He licked the tip of his pencil and wrote, slow and deliberate, in the book, "Delilah Quinn." He paused, thinking, "Disturbing the peace." "That is not fair," she cried, the injustice of it stinging more than the insult from the railroad man. "Fair is what the law says it is. And Mr. Calder, he likes a peaceful town. He does not like complications." Voss snapped the book shut and slid it into his breast pocket, patting it twice. He finally stepped aside, granting her passage. Delilah scrambled off the boardwalk, her worn-out boots sinking into the deep dust of the street. She did not look back. She could feel Voss's eyes on her, cold and assessing. She could feel the lingering stare of the men in the trading post window. She clutched the cheap calico, the rough fabric digging into her arms. Holden Pike was already gone, his buckboard a shrinking speck on the trail north to Juniper Flats. Delilah hurried toward the edge of town, toward the collection of shacks known as Mesquite Hollow, toward the small room she shared with her aunt. The relief of the paid bill was already gone, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. She had been seen, she had been noted, and in Sagebrush Crossing, being noted by Calder's man was the most dangerous thing of all. The red dust coated her ankles, heavy as chains. Mesquite Hollow was not so much a part of Sagebrush Crossing as it was the place the town swept its refuse. It was a scar of lean-tos and sod-roofed shacks huddled in a dry wash, invisible from the main street. The air here smelled different, less of tobacco and new lumber, more of boiling laundry, stale cooking grease, and the sharp tang of the communal latrine. This was where Delilah lived. She hurried past the neighbors who offered no greeting, their faces shut tight with their own miseries. She entered the one-room shack she shared with her aunt, ducking under the low doorframe. Aunt Elspeth was sitting in the one good chair, a patchwork quilt over her knees despite the oppressive heat. Her face, once round and cheerful, had collapsed inward, her skin the color of old parchment. The air in the room was close, dominated by the medicinal, bittersweet smell of the laudanum. "You were gone long," Elspeth rasped, her eyes not moving from the warped floorboards. "Mrs. Banner was busy." Delilah lied, her voice soft. She unwrapped the calico, the cheap blue fabric looking garish in the dim light. "But I got the cloth. It will be softer." "Soft," the old woman murmured, unconvinced. Delilah set about her chores, pumping water into the basin, her movements economical and practiced. She was used to this life. This was the penance for her past. The past had a name, Amos Crow. He was the Reverend's son, a young man with a strong jaw, blonde hair, and a soul as weak as watery milk. They were to be married. Delilah had been 18, and her future had seemed as bright and solid as the pine floors of the new church. Then had come the whispers. They had started in the Ladies' Aid Society, a hiss of speculation that grew into a roar of certainty. The whispers centered on the fever Delilah had endured when she was 16, a terrible, burning sickness that had stolen 3 weeks of her life and left her thin as a rail. The old doctor, in a moment of weary candor, had muttered to her aunt that such a fever, raging so hot, often burned the seed from the soil. It was a rural diagnosis, steeped in superstition, but it had been enough. The rumor spread from the church pews to the saloon rail. Delilah Quinn, the pretty, quiet girl, was barren. She was a field where nothing would grow. Amos, whose father preached nightly on the divine mandate to be fruitful and multiply, had been trapped. He had met Delilah by the creek, his handsome face crumpled in a mask of spiritual pain. He had spoken of trials, of God's mysterious will, of his duty to his father's legacy, which required heirs. the engagement was broken. And Delilah was ruined. Not in the common way, not by a man's touch, but by a fever. She was labeled damaged. She became the troubled girl Prudence Banner had named her. She was a walking emblem of failure. A woman without purpose in a world where a woman's only purpose was to bear sons. She lived in Mesquite Hollow now, surviving on the scraps of mending she took in from the saloon girls and the mercy of her aunt's meager pension. At night, when Elspeth's laudanum-laced breathing finally settled into a rhythm, Delilah would write in her journal. It was a small book, its cover warped by damp. She wrote with ink she made herself from boiled oak galls and vinegar, the resulting script a pale, ghostly brown. She wrote of the price of flour, of the ache in her back, of the suffocating weight of being seen as useless. Every Sunday, the sound of the church bell would roll across the flats and into the hollow, the bell her father had helped raise, the bell that was meant to call the faithful. To Delilah, it was not a call to prayer. It was a verdict, ringing out over the town again and again, Baron, Baron, Baron. Far north of town, where the air was thinner and the pines grew thick, Holden Pike rode into the yard of Blue Willow Ranch. The place was silent. The only sound was the jingle of his harness and the lowing of a single cow in the high pasture. His cabin was small, but built of solid, square-hewn logs. The joints chinked tight against the wind. He unhitched his team, his movements slow, deliberate. He had worked his land to the point of exhaustion for 3 years, driven by a need to numb the constant, howling ache in his chest. He stepped inside the cabin. It was immaculate. 1 cup, 1 plate, 1 fork, all washed and dried on the rack. A single iron bedstead, the blankets pulled taut. His past was not a rumor. It was a patch of scorched earth and blackened timbers 50 yards from his front door. It had been a cold night in late October, 3 years gone. A windstorm, the kind that screamed down from the high peaks. He had been in the cabin, boiling coffee. His wife, Sarah, had been asleep. The baby beside her in a wooden cradle Holden had spent a month carving. The baby was new, only 6 days on earth, a small, perfect thing he was still afraid to hold. He never knew what tipped the lantern in the barn. The wind, maybe, or a restless horse. He only knew the roar. He had burst outside to see the barn consumed, a volcano of flame roaring into the black sky. The horses screamed, but worse, Sarah had woken. Thinking the cabin was on fire, she had done what a mother does. She had snatched the baby. She had run. She ran the wrong way. She ran toward the barn, toward the horses she loved, maybe thinking he was trapped inside. Holden had screamed, but the wind tore the word from his mouth. He saw her, a fleeting shadow against the wall of fire, just as the main beam gave way. He had tried. He had plunged into the inferno, the heat searing his hands and face, but it was too late. The roof collapsed, taking everything. He had spent the rest of the night digging in the embers with his bare hands. He found nothing. Since that night, Holden Pike worked. He did not drink. He did not talk. He worked until his muscles failed, and he fell into bed, and he slept for a few hours without dreams. Then he woke and did it again. He avoided town, avoided the sympathetic looks, the whispers of that poor man. His grief was his own, and he would not have it pawed at by strangers. Now, a new threat had come. He walked to his small table and unrolled a map. His property, marked in black ink, and cutting right through his best pasture, a new line, drawn in bright red ink. Ephraim Calder's aqueduct. Calder, the man who owned the bank, the freight office, and half the county council, had a plan. He was going to bring water from the high country springs down to the flatlands, to sell at exorbitant prices to the railroad for their steam engines. Holden's land and the spring that fed it was in the way. Holden had refused to sell. The land was not just land, it was a memorial. It was the last place his wife and child had drawn breath. So Calder had begun to squeeze. Holden picked up the notice that had been delivered by Deputy Voss last week. It was a new tax assessment. His property taxes had been tripled, citing new development potential for the valley. It was a lie, a legal fiction, but it was a debt he could not pay, not with cattle prices so low. He was being choked, slowly and methodically. His land, his fortress of silence, was being stolen from under him. He crushed the paper in his fist. He would not sell. He would fight, but he was one man, and his only weapons were silence and exhaustion. A few days later, Delilah was in town, carrying a heavy basket of mended shirts to the saloon. She took the back alley, avoiding the main street, avoiding the Cedar Trace trading post. But as she passed the side of the building, a loading area piled high with empty crates, something caught her eye. Carved into the rough, sun-bleached wood of the wall, low, as if done by someone sitting on the ground, were 5 words. The letters were deep, gouged with a rusty nail. "Nobody is useless in the wind." Delilah stopped. Her basket suddenly felt light. She read the words again. She thought of the wind, the endless, scouring wind of the high plains. It was a force that cared nothing for crops, or comfort, or plans. It just was. She reached out, her fingers tracing the rough letters. Useless, the word that had defined her. Here, someone had defied it. Someone else who felt scoured, pushed, and small had sat here and carved their defiance. She felt a strange kinship with the anonymous carver. She stood there for a long time, just touching the words, and she felt the knot of shame in her throat loosen, just a fraction. She felt, for a moment, a little less brittle. The feeling did not last the night. When she returned to the hollow, she found it tucked beneath the broken stone that served as her doorstep, a piece of cheap, ruled paper, folded into a small square. It was not Holden's. She opened it inside, by the flickering light of the tallow candle. The handwriting was jagged, slanted, as if the pen had been stabbed at the paper. It was anonymous. "Stay away from decent men. They don't want your kind of trouble. A man like Pike deserves better than a barren whore." The last word was gouged so deep it had nearly torn the paper. Delilah's blood ran cold, then hot. The relief from the inscription vanished, replaced by a suffocating, familiar terror. Someone had seen Holden Pike's small act of kindness and twisted it into something ugly and possessive. They were warning her off. Whore. The word was a brand, burning her. She crumpled the note, her hands shaking. She wanted to burn it, but she was afraid. She hid it deep in the pocket of her apron, a small, toxic secret. She turned to her aunt. Elspeth was restless, her hands picking at the threads of the quilt. The laudanum was wearing off, and the pain was rising. "Water?" Elspeth whispered. Delilah brought the cup. She knelt by the chair and lifted her aunt's head, holding the cup to her dry, cracked lips. Elspeth drank, her eyes fluttering. The old woman's gaze, usually cloudy and distant, suddenly sharpened. She stared at Delilah, a look of profound, heartbreaking recognition dawning on her face. Her hand, frail and light as a dried leaf, rose and touched Delilah's cheek. "Sarah," Elspeth whispered. Delilah froze. Sarah was her mother. Elspeth's sister. Dead 20 years. "No, Auntie," Delilah said gently, her throat tight. "It is me. It is Delilah." "No, Sarah." The old woman's voice was full of a strange, sudden certainty. Her thumb stroked Delilah's skin. "You came back. I knew you would not leave me." Her eyes filled with tears. "My girl, my own daughter, you are safe." The word struck Delilah like a physical blow. Daughter. The one word she had been told she could never hear. The one title she was forever denied. The word that defined her entire lack of worth. And here it was, given to her in a moment of fevered confusion. A dam inside her broke. not the one that held back tears of shame, but a deeper one that held back years of solitary grief. It was a pain so sharp and so sudden it stole her breath. She did not correct her aunt. She could not. She leaned into that frail, trembling touch. Closing her eyes, she covered her aunt's hand with her own. "I am here, Mama," she whispered, the word feeling vast and holy and forbidden on her tongue. It was a lie, and it was the deepest truth she had ever known. It shattered her, and in the same moment, it pieced her back together, but in a new, unfamiliar shape. Later, long after her aunt had fallen into a fitful sleep, Delilah sat on the broken front step of the shack, staring into the darkness of Mesquite Hollow. The vile, anonymous note was a hard knot in her apron pocket, the phantom feel of her aunt's hand, the echo of the word daughter warred inside her. She felt exposed, tender, and terrified. She did not hear the rider. There was no jingle of harness, no hoof fall, just a shadow detaching from the deeper shadows at the edge of the wash. A silhouette of a man on a horse, pausing for just a second before melting back into the night, silent as a great owl. Delilah tensed, her hand flying to her throat. Voss, had he followed her? She waited, her heart hammering. For 10 long minutes. Nothing, just the wind and the distant cry of a coyote. She crept out from the step, scanning the darkness. Then she saw it. On the ground, exactly where the anonymous, hateful note had been that afternoon, sat a smooth river stone. Beneath it, holding it steady against the wind, was a piece of folded paper, and beside that, a large, fragrant bundle of dried, wild sage. Her hands trembled for a different reason now. She snatched them up and hurried back inside. By the low, guttering candle, she looked at the gift. The sage was the high country kind, the type that smelled like clean rain and pine. She unfolded the paper. It was a scrap from a feed sack. The handwriting was not jagged. It was slow, deliberate, the letters carved into the paper by a hand more used to an axe handle than a pencil. There were only 4 words. For a quiet sleep. It was not a threat. It was a benediction. Holden Pike. He had paid her debt, and he had not forgotten her. He had seen where she lived. He had seen the darkness she inhabited. And he had brought her this. She dropped the hateful note from her pocket onto the floor, as if it had burned her. She lifted the bundle of sage and crushed it between her hands, burying her face in the fragrant stems. The scent was sharp, clean, and strong. It smelled of the mountains, of a place far from sickness, and whispers, and shame. It was the first act of simple, uncomplicated kindness she had known in years, and it anchored her, just as the carving on the wall had. She sat there, in the dark, just breathing. 3 days later, he found her. She was leaving the saloon with a basket of linens, keeping to the back alleys, her head down. She did not see him until his horse blocked the path. She started, nearly dropping the basket. "Mr. Pike!" Holden Pike looked down from the saddle. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "I need a favor." Delilah was stunned. "A favor?" "You can read, and you can cipher," he stated. "My books are a wreck. Receipts in a biscuit tin. I cannot make sense of them. I need them put right." "Oh," she said, absorbing the request. Yes, I can do that." "I cannot pay wages," he said flatly, getting to the heart of it. "But the land is high. The wood is seasoned. My cow is fresh." He jerked his chin toward Mesquite Hollow. "You have no firewood. Your aunt needs milk." It was not charity. It was a transaction. A way for her to pay the debt she felt she owed. And the debt he had paid, it was practical, it was honorable. It was his way of repaying it with something kind. He was giving her a way to earn, not to beg. "I will," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "When?" "Tomorrow. Be on the road at sunup. I will meet you." He turned his horse without another word and was gone. Delilah watched him go, the bundle of dried sage still scenting her small room, his abrupt offer hanging in the air. He had offered her work, real work. The next morning, the air was cold and sharp. She met him on the trail, and they rode up to Juniper Flats in his buckboard. The silence between them was vast, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had no currency in small talk. Blue Willow Ranch was not a ranch so much as a declaration of war against the wilderness. The cabin was small but solid. The barn was new. The raw, yellow pine planks a stark contrast to the patch of scorched earth beside it. But it was clean. The air was thin and smelled of pine and snowmelt, a world away from the sour dust of the hollow. Holden led her not to the cabin, but to a section of fence on the west pasture. The spring thaw had heaved two of the posts. "The books can wait," he said. "This cannot." He handed her a heavy canvas apron, stiff with use. "Hold the rails steady. Do not let them slip." For the next 2 hours, they worked. It was hard, physical labor. Holden used the heavy clamshell post-hole digger, his muscles bunching and releasing under his shirt, the sweat staining the fabric dark. He worked with a grim, relentless rhythm, the thud of the tool biting into the wet earth. Delilah's job was to hold the new cedar rails in place while he set them. Her arms ached, and her hands, soft from needlework, were scraped raw by the rough sawn wood. But she did not complain. She held the board steady. The sun beat down. She smelled the sharp, turpentine scent of the cut pine and the metallic tang of Holden's sweat. He moved to nail the final rail. "Hold it tight," he grunted. She braced the board with her shoulder, her hands flat against the wood. He set the nail, his own large, calloused hand brushing against the back of hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a startling mix of his roughness and the sun's heat. He hammered the nail, his movements precise and powerful. 3 strokes. The sound rang sharp and clean in the high country air. "Done," he said. They stood back, looking at the mended fence. It was straight. It was strong. Delilah felt a strange, unfamiliar swell of pride. She had not just mended a shirt. She had helped build something. "Now the books," he said. He led her inside the cabin. It was as she expected. 1 chair, 1 table, a bed built into the wall. It was the cleanest bachelor's quarters she had ever seen. "There," he pointed to the biscuit tin on the mantel. Delilah sat at the table, his table, and opened the tin. It was exactly as he had said. A jumble of receipts, bills of lading, and greasy IOUs. "I will need paper and ink," she said. He provided them. She set to work, her hands finding their familiar rhythm, the pen scratching across the paper. She organized the chaos, creating columns for feed, for tack, for medicine, for cattle sales. Holden sat on the porch, sharpening tools, the rhythmic rasp of the file the only sound. Delilah worked for hours. This was her ground. In this, she was not troubled or barren. She was competent. She was an expert. The numbers lined up, the ledgers balanced. Then she found them. There were 3 receipts, identical, tucked at the very bottom. They were not from the feed store or the blacksmith. They were from the county assessor's office. Each was for road toll fees, and each was signed with a flourishing, arrogant signature, Clayton Voss, deputy. "Holden," she called out, her voice quiet. He appeared in the doorway, filling it, blocking the light. "What is this road toll fee?" she asked, holding up one of the slips. "You paid it 3 times. Holden's face darkened. He came over, taking the paper from her. "Voss, he said it is a new toll, for road improvements, for using the main trail down to Sagebrush." "But there is no toll gate," Delilah said, her mind working, connecting the numbers. "And this is not a county receipt. This is just a piece of paper with his name on it. He is stealing from you." Holden looked at the paper, his jaw tightening. He knew, of course he knew. but seeing it laid out, confirmed by her neat columns, made the theft stark and undeniable. "It is Calder's doing," he said, his voice flat. "He squeezes from the top with taxes, and he squeezes from the bottom with this." "You should not pay it," she said. "And have Voss impound my wagon or my team." He crushed the receipt in his fist, the same way he had crushed the tax notice. The air in the small cabin was suddenly thick with his anger, a cold, still anger that felt more dangerous than shouting. Delilah looked away, back to the ledgers. "I will note it," she said softly, "under a new column, theft." Holden looked at her, surprised by the venom in her voice. Before he could reply, the food he had simmering on the stove boiled over. "Damn," he muttered, turning. Lunch was simple: beans from the pot, thick with molasses, and a slab of cornbread, crusty from a skillet. He put a plate in front of her without a word. They ate in silence. The beans were hot, smoky. The cornbread was dense and filling. It was the most satisfying meal Delilah had eaten in months. She was looking at his handwriting on a feed bill, a near illiterate scrawl. "You spell oats with an E," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. Holden grunted, embarrassed. "Reading is one thing, writing is another." "It is a good E," she said, and then she laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, a genuine light laugh that surprised her as much as it did him. Holden stopped, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He stared at her. The sound of a woman's laughter in this cabin. It was a ghost. It was Sarah. He stood up so abruptly his chair scraped on the floor. He turned his back to her, stalking to the open doorway, staring out at the horizon. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white. Delilah's laugh died instantly. Her face flushed, thinking she had offended him. "I am sorry, "It is nothing," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He did not turn around. "Just finished your food." The moment passed, heavy and awkward. As if summoned by the tension, the world outside changed. The bright, clear sunlight dimmed, turning a sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a breeze, suddenly began to moan. Holden's head snapped up. "Get inside." "What?" "The wind, it is shifting. Dust storm. Get in." It came on them in a rush. A low brown wall of dirt rose from the south, blotting out the mountains. The sound was a rising, high-pitched scream. Holden slammed the cabin door, plunging the room into near darkness. He shoved a rag under the crack. "They do not last," he said, his voice strained over the roar. "But they are mean." "My aunt," Delilah whispered, thinking of the poorly chinked walls of the shack. "Nothing to be done," Holden said. "We wait." The storm hit the cabin like a solid object. The small building shuddered. Dust, fine as flour, began to spray through invisible cracks, coating everything in a brown film. The noise was deafening, a physical assault. Delilah pressed her hands to her ears. The cabin, which had felt solid, now felt like a small, fragile box. "It is holding." Holden yelled over the din. He was standing near the center of the room, braced, as if expecting the walls to cave in. Then, a sharp crack, followed by the sound of splintering wood. "The porch roof!" Holden shouted. He lunged for the door. "No, you cannot go out there. The roof boards will come loose. They will fly like axes." He yanked the door open. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the outside wall. A wall of blinding, stinging dirt filled the doorway. Holden plunged into it. Delilah screamed his name. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. She stood in the doorway, the grit scouring her face, her eyes squeezed shut, calling for him. He stumbled back in, dragging a heavy beam behind him. He was coated in dust, unrecognizable. "The main post snapped," he choked, coughing. It is collapsing. He braced the beam against the sagging porch roof, trying to wedge it into place, but the wind was tearing at him. I cannot hold it, he yelled. Delilah ran. She grabbed his heavy duster from its peg by the door. Without thinking, she plunged back out into the storm. Holden! He looked, his face a mask of dirt, his eyes wide with surprise. She threw the heavy coat. It was caught by the wind, flattened like a sail. He snatched it from the air. In one powerful motion, he wrapped the coat around the top of the beam and his arm, using the thick canvas to hold the splintered wood, wedging it against the roof. The wind tore at him, but the coat held. He got the beam braced. The porch groaned but held. He fell back into the cabin, dragging her with him, and kicked the door shut. They collapsed onto the floor, coughing, spitting dirt, chests heaving. The cabin was dark. The only sound the shriek of the wind and their own ragged breathing. They were on the floor, huddled near the door. He had pulled her away from the window. They were close. So close she could feel the heat rolling off his skin, even through his damp, dirty shirt. She could hear his breathing, a deep, shuddering sound in his chest, distinct from the howl of the storm. He had his arm half raised, still braced against the door, shielding her. She was tucked against his side. The duster was still outside, wrapped around the beam, saving his porch. You are, he coughed, a damn fool, running out like that. So are you, she breathed, her voice trembling. They stayed like that, huddled in the roaring darkness, for nearly an hour. The storm raged, trying to tear the world apart. But inside the small cabin, braced against the door, there was a tiny, shared pocket of stillness. When the wind finally died, the silence was as sudden as the storm had been. Holden stood, his legs stiff. The world outside was invisible, shrouded in a thick brown haze. It is past, he said. The adrenaline fled, leaving Delilah shaking. She looked at her hands, which were caked in mud. Her dress was ruined. I need to, she started, her teeth chattering. He handed her a clean rag and the water bucket. Clean up. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a strange, muted haze. The sun was a pale wafer in the brown sky. They worked, cleaning the dust from the cabin. Later, as the air cleared, she saw his saddle, thrown from a rail by the wind. The leather of the seat was torn. I can fix that, she said. He looked skeptical, but he brought it in. She took out her mending kit, the small leather roll she carried everywhere, with an awl, a waxed thread, and a curved needle. She began to stitch the heavy leather. Her movements were quick, economical, the stitches tiny and perfectly even. Holden watched her hands. He had seen hands do hard work, rough work. He had never seen hands do this. Such fine, strong, precise work. He watched, fascinated, as the tear in the heavy leather disappeared under her fingers. Where did you learn that? He asked. My father, he was a cobbler, she said, not looking up. He taught me leather before he taught me cloth. When she was done, the saddle looked almost new. In return, he showed her something. He took her to the barn, where a new colt was tied. You tie a halter wrong, a horse can break its own neck, he said. He took the rope. You do not just tie a knot, you tie a dawn knot. He guided her hands, showing her how the rope looped and pulled. It holds against a panic, he said, his rough fingers brushing hers as he adjusted the rope. It will hold a stallion, but you pull this one end, and it comes free. No matter how tight, it comes loose when you need it to. She practiced it until she got it right, a knot that was strong, but also freeing. As dusk approached, a calf that had been separated from its mother in the storm began to cry. It was a small, white-faced heifer, stumbling around the yard, frantic. Delilah went to it, kneeling in the dirt, ignoring her ruined dress. She held out her hand. "It is all right," she murmured. "It is all right, now." The calf butted against her, sniffing, desperate for comfort. Delilah stroked its head, her voice a low, soothing croon. She scratched its ears until its frantic cries softened to a low rumble. It leaned its whole body against her knee, pressing its wet nose into her hand, finding a moment of peace. Holden stopped, watching from the barn doorway. He had seen women with children. He had seen his own wife, Sarah, hold their son. He was watching a woman the entire town had labeled barren and damaged, and he was seeing a gentleness so profound it made his throat ache. He saw the lie the world had told about her, the hardness in his eyes, the gray winter sky, softened. It was not pity. It was recognition. It was time for her to go. He hitched the buckboard. The ride back was silent, the world coated in a fresh layer of brown dust. He stopped the wagon at the edge of the hollow, not wanting to draw Voss's attention to her, or to them. He handed down the heavy can of milk and a large bundle of firewood. "This will last you," he said. "Thank you, Holden." It was the first time she had used his name. "The books are good," he said, the closest he could come to a compliment. You work hard." She nodded, turning to go. "Wait." She turned back. He was fumbling with something under the seat. He pulled out an old wool scarf. It was dark gray, frayed at the ends, but it was thick and clean. It smelled of the pine soap he used. "Nights get cold," he said gruffly, shoving it toward her. "The hollow is low. The cold settles." She reached out to take it. The air was cool now, the sun gone. Her fingers were cold. His hand was warm from the horse's reins. As she took the scarf, her fingers brushed his palm. It was not like the brief touch at the fence line. This time, his hand half closed, his fingers grazing hers for just a second longer than necessary. It was not a grasp. It was a question. A jolt, sharp and warm, shot up her arm. It was a touch that had no pity in it, no calculation. It was just human warmth. She snatched her hand back, clutching the scarf. "Thank you," she whispered again. He nodded. "Once. Sun up, day after tomorrow. The fence needs more." Delilah watched him drive away, the heavy scarf clutched in her hand, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin long after he had disappeared into the dusty twilight. The work at Blue Willow Ranch settled into a rhythm. Every 2 days, Delilah would make the long walk up the trail, arriving just after dawn. She and Holden would wordlessly mend what was broken: a sagging gate, a loose trough, a split harness. Then, while he rode the high pastures, she would sit at his small table, his entire financial life spread before her in the biscuit tin. The ranch, once a fortress of his grief, now held 2 people. They worked, they ate, they were silent, but it was a shared silence, and it was changing them both. Delilah's mind, however, was not silent. It was fixed on the 3 slips of paper signed by Clayton Voss, the road toll fees. They were a splinter under her skin. They were wrong. And in her world of balanced columns, wrong was an enemy. On her next trip to town for her aunt's laudanum, she took the receipts with her. She did not go to the trading post. She went to the county courthouse, a small, square building that smelled of dry paper and stale tobacco. The county clerk was Mr. Harlan Yates. He was a small man, perpetually dusted with ink, who wore a green visor and sleeve garters. He lived for the precision of his ledgers. He was not a brave man, nor a political one. He was simply a man of order. He despised Ephraim Calder for his loud, messy ambition, but feared him too much to speak. Delilah approached his counter. "Mr. Yates." He looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Yes, I am sorting the books for Mr. Holden Pike," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I found these. I am trying to reconcile them with his tax statements." She pushed the 3 receipts signed by Voss under the grate. Yates picked them up, holding them to the light. His thin nose wrinkled. "This is Voss's own paper. This is not a county receipt." "He said it was a road toll fee," Delilah said, keeping her face neutral. "I was wondering where in the county budget this toll is recorded. I cannot find the ordinance." Yates's annoyance turned to a fussy, professional pride. "That is because there is no such ordinance. Miss Quinn, there is no road toll fee." He turned, pulling a massive, leather-bound volume from the shelf behind him and dropping it on the counter with a heavy thud. "This is the county budget for the year. You will find no such toll." "Then where would this money go?" Delilah pressed, feigning simple confusion. "It would go," Yates said, his voice dropping, "into Deputy Voss's pocket. This is theft, Miss Quinn. Plain and simple, but I cannot act on it." "I see." Delilah paused. "Mr. Pike believed it was for the Road and Bridge Fund. He mentioned Mr. Calder's new aqueduct plan." Yates's face tightened. He looked around the empty office. "The aqueduct," he whispered, "is a private venture. It is not county business." "Is it not?" Delilah asked. She saw another ledger on his desk, this one newer. It was open. On the page, she could see a map. Yates, seeing her gaze, instinctively moved to close the book, but he was too late. Delilah had already seen the red line. It cut directly through a parcel labeled H. Pike. "There is another matter," Yates said, trying to distract her, holding up Voss's receipts. "These advances. I wonder." He went to another shelf and pulled down the disbursement ledger for the Road and Bridge Fund. He ran his finger down the page. "Ah." Delilah leaned in. "What is it?" Mister, Voss has been taking survey advances from the fund, here and here, 3 times in 2 months, large sums." Yates was offended, not by the corruption, but by the sloppiness. "This is highly irregular. The fund is for contractors, not for deputies." "And who authorized the fund?" Delilah asked. Yates tapped the top of the page. "The county commissioner, Ephraim Calder." There it was. The link. Calder was using county money to pay his pet deputy, who was in turn shaking down Holden with fake tolls. Delilah saw the other ledger again, the one with the map. "Mr. Yates, that proposal," she said, pointing. "The one for the water initiative. May I see the authorization for it?" "It is not an initiative, Miss Quinn." Yates sniffed. "It is a private proposal. It has not been voted on. It is not law." "I understand. But whose proposal is it?" Exasperated, Yates flipped the cover sheet. "It is Mr. Calder's. Of course. Everything is—" Delilah's eyes locked on the bottom of the page. The signature. Ephraim Calder. The law was not passed, but Calder and Voss were already operating as if it were squeezing Holden from 2 directions. She thanked Mr. Yates, who was already lost in his own columns, deeply agitated by the irregularities. Delilah left the courthouse, her heart hammering. She knew the what. Now she needed the why. She still had mending to deliver to the Tin Cup Saloon. She went in the back way, as usual, to the small room where the saloon girls kept their things. The bar was loud. It being near supper time, she handed the bundle of repaired shirts to one of the girls. "Cora, you look like you have seen a ghost, honey," Cora said, handing her a few coins. "Just the sun," Delilah murmured. She lingered, pretending to check her basket. From the main room, she heard a loud, booming laugh. Ephraim Calder. He was at a table with 3 men from the railroad. "Do not you worry your heads about the timeline." Calder bellowed, his voice oiled with whiskey. "The water will be ready for your tank by the new year. I guarantee it." "That is a bold promise, Ephraim." One of the railroad men said, "That aqueduct has to cross a dozen parcels, and you need a holding tank. That high spring is on Pike's land." "Pike," Calder said, and his voice turned cold and sharp. "Pike is a man with a heavy burden, a heavy tax burden, a man who cannot seem to pay his bills." He chuckled. "A man, I hear, who is about to be sold out for back taxes. The county will take that land, gentlemen, and I will buy it at auction for pennies on the dollar. Forcing a tax sale, eh?" "It is just business," Calder said. "He will be off it by Christmas. You will have your water." Delilah's blood turned to ice. It was not just a squeeze. It was a foreclosure, a deliberate, orchestrated plan to steal Holden's ranch. She fled the saloon. She had the what and the why. Now she needed the how. How did Calder control so many people Voss was on his payroll? But what about Prudence Banner? She found herself walking toward the trading post. Prudence had been the one to humiliate her. Prudence had been the one to call her troubled. Delilah entered the store. It was empty. Prudence was at the counter, scratching in her main ledger. "Well," Prudence snapped, not looking up, "I do not have time for browsers." "I need," Delilah said, her mind racing, "a charcoal pencil for marking cloth." Prudence huffed, annoyed. She turned to get one from a drawer. In that moment, a woman hurried in, thin and worried. It was Martha Ellery, a small-time rancher from the next valley. "Prudence, please," Martha whispered, twisting her apron. "I just need flour. My husband. He is sick. I will have money next week." "Credit is done, Martha," Prudence said, her voice flat. "You know that." "Please, the children—" Prudence looked at the door. She looked at Delilah. Then she sighed, a long, put-upon sound. She grabbed a sack of flour and shoved it at Martha. "Fine, but you know the terms." Prudence did not write in the main ledger. Instead, she pulled a small, black book from under the counter. She opened it, dipped her pen, and had Martha sign. "And you tell your husband," Prudence whispered, her voice like ice, "that Mr. Calder expects him to vote yes on the water initiative at the next town meeting. This flower is his reminder." Martha nodded, terrified, and fled. Delilah stood frozen, the charcoal pencil in her hand. Prudence slammed the black book shut and slid it back under the counter. She stared at Delilah. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing," Delilah whispered. She put a coin on the counter for the pencil and walked out, her legs shaking. She had it. Calder was using Prudence. He was paying the debts of the poor, but not with cash. He was paying with flour, with medicine, with seed, and in return, he owned them. He owned their votes. He owned their silence. Delilah walked back to the courthouse. She was no longer afraid. She was cold. Mr. Yates was still there, muttering over his ledgers. Mr. Yates," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I believe I made a mistake in my transcription of Mr. Pike's tax record. May I see the county assessment roll again just for a moment?" He grunted, pointing to the shelf. "Do not misfile it." He was distracted, already back to his own numbers. Delilah pulled the Road and Bridge Fund ledger. She found the page with Voss's advances. She took the charcoal pencil from her pocket. She tore a page from her own small, empty journal. Her hand did not shake. She quickly, precisely, copied the dates, the amounts, and the descriptions. C. Voss, survey advance, $300. C. Voss, survey advance, $250. She folded the paper. She heard Yates stand up. She quickly reshelved the ledger, her back to him. She walked out of the courthouse. She did not run. She walked down the alley behind the building. When she was sure she was alone, she stopped. She lifted the hem of her worn skirt. She pulled up her wool sock. She slid the folded paper and the small charcoal pencil into her boot, flat against her ankle. It was a trick her aunt had taught her. "Men check purses," Elspeth had rasped. "They check baskets. They never check a woman's boot. Hide your worth where they will not look." She was hiding her worth. She was hiding Holden's only chance. As she stepped out of the alley, she saw him. Deputy Clayton Voss. He was standing across the street, by the telegraph office, pretending to read a notice. But he was not reading. He was watching her. He had seen her go into the courthouse. He had seen her come out. He had seen her go into the saloon. He had seen her go to the trading post. And now, he had seen her come out of the courthouse a second time. He did not smile. He did not move. He just watched her. His eyes were flat, like a snake's. He knew. He did not know what she had, but he knew she was digging. The troubled girl had become a threat. Delilah turned, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She walked toward Mesquite Hollow. She did not look back. That night, the hollow was quiet. Too quiet. Aunt Elspeth was asleep, the laudanum and the fresh milk easing her into a rare, deep slumber. Delilah sat at the table, the charcoal pencil in her hand. She stared at the flame of her single candle. A sound. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into blackness. She crept to the window. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. At first, she saw nothing, just the dark, slumped shapes of the other shacks. Then, a movement. A horse, a single rider, sitting just at the edge of the wash, beyond the last shack. He was just a silhouette, motionless. He was not Voss. This man was bigger, broader. He just sat there, in the dark, watching her window. He was not trying to hide. He was a message. We are here. We see you. You are not safe. Delilah backed away from the window, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, watching the door, the paper in her boot pressing into her skin like a brand. The rider was gone by dawn. Delilah did not walk up the trail to the ranch. She ran. She was breathless, stumbling, when she saw Holden riding down to meet her. He saw her face and his own went rigid. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not ask if she was hurt. He swung down from his horse, his eyes scanning the trail behind her. Who? A rider. She choked, gasping for breath. He watched my house, all night. Holden, they know. Voss knows. Calder. They know I am looking. Holden's face was grim. He looked at her, standing there in the middle of the trail, shaking like a leaf, but still on her feet, still holding her basket. You are not safe there anymore, he said. It was not a suggestion. I cannot, she started. My aunt, the town, the rumors. The rumors, he said, his voice hard. Are you worried about rumors? Or are you worried about a knife in your back in that dry wash? She flinched. He was right. Get your aunt, he said. Get her things. She cannot ride. She cannot make the walk. I will bring the buckboard, tonight, after dark. He looked at her, his gray eyes unblinking. You cannot stay there. Delilah. She looked at this man, this silent, broken man who was offering her the one thing no one else ever had, safety. She thought of the cold-eyed rider. She thought of the paper in her boot. I will not be a burden, she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. I will not be your charity. The rumors will be vile. Let them talk, he said. No. She met his gaze. She would not trade one kind of shame for another. I accept. But as your housekeeper, I work, I earn my keep, I run the kitchen, I keep the books. It is a position, a job. Holden Pike looked at her. Seeing the iron pride that had kept her from shattering, he had offered her shelter. She was offering him a bargain. He nodded. Once. A job, he agreed. Pack your things. I will be there by 9. He turned to ride back to the ranch, to prepare. Delilah started the long walk back to the hollow, her mind made up. That evening, as Holden hitched the team to the buckboard, the sun set in a fiery, bloody red that stained the clouds. The air was perfectly still, heavy. As the last light faded from the sky and the ranch was plunged into the deep, cold dark of the high country, a sound echoed from the far ridges. A single long hunting howl of a wolf. It was not a cry of loneliness. It was a cry of hunger, and it sounded terribly close. The move from Mesquite Hollow was a whisper in the dark. Holden arrived at 9, as promised. He did not knock. He simply materialized at the door, a solid shadow in the moonlight. He lifted Aunt Elspeth as if she weighed nothing, his movements economical and surprisingly gentle. He settled her into the buckboard, wrapped in every blanket Delilah owned, his hands, calloused and rough from wire and wood, tucking the edges in with a tenderness that made Delilah's throat tighten. They left the hollow without a word, the wheels of the buckboard muffled by the thick dust. Delilah did not look back. When they reached Blue Willow Ranch, the air was cold, snapping with the clean scent of pine. The stars seemed close enough to touch. Holden had prepared. He had moved his own sparse belongings, a bedroll, a saddle, his rifle to the small, clean tack room in the new barn. "You and your aunt take the cabin," he said. It was not a request. "The bed is solid. She will be warm." "But where will you—" Delilah started. "I am in the barn. It is dry. I have slept in worse." He would not meet her eye. He was already unhitching the team. The bargain was set. She was the housekeeper. He was the employer. The cabin was her domain. The barn was his. A chasm of propriety lay between them, as wide and dark as the yard. He helped her move Elspeth inside. The old woman, soothed by the motion of the wagon, had fallen into a rare, peaceful sleep. They settled her on the single iron bedstead, the one Holden had slept in for 3 years. Delilah watched as Holden laid one final, heavy wool blanket over her. "She will be warm," he said again, his voice rough. He backed out of the cabin. "Bolt the door." He disappeared into the darkness, toward the barn. Delilah stood in the middle of the small, clean room. She heard the solid sound of the barn door sliding shut. She bolted the cabin door. She was safe. The paper in her boot felt less like a brand and more like a weapon. But she could not sleep. The silence of the high country was deafening. It was not the thin, watchful silence of the hollow, punctuated by drunken shouts or coughing. This was a vast, deep silence, alive with the sounds of the wind moving through a million pine needles, the creak of cooling timbers, the distant shift of a horse in its stall. Aunt Elspeth's breathing was the loudest thing in the room, a deep, slow, untroubled rhythm. The laudanum, the milk, and the safety had worked a miracle. Delilah lay on the pallet she had made for herself by the cold hearth. She stared at the ceiling beams, shadows in the faint starlight. She was safe, but her nerves were strung tight as a new fence line. She kept hearing the sound of the horse in the wash. She kept seeing Voss's flat, reptilian eyes. After an hour, she could not bear it. She rose, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She went to the window and looked out. He was not in the barn. A small point of light flickered in the yard. Holden was on the porch, sitting on the top step. He had built a small fire, not in the main fire pit, but in an old cast-iron brazier, a small, contained circle of warmth. He was sitting guard. Delilah wrapped her thin shawl around her shoulders. She unbolted the door. The sound of the latch clicking was loud in the night air. He turned his head. He was not startled. He had been waiting. She stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit her instantly. "I could not sleep," she whispered. He nodded, his face half in shadow, half in the orange glow of the fire. "The air is different up here." A small tin pot was set near the coals. He picked it up with a gloved hand and poured a dark liquid into a tin cup. "I made tea." She stepped forward and took the cup from him. It was the sage, the sharp, clean scent of the high country sage he had left on her doorstep. The cup was hot, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. She sat on the step, a few feet away from him. Not touching. They stared into the small fire. You should be in the barn, she said, her voice low. You will freeze. First night, he said simply, staring into the flames. A man on watch is a good luck. They sat in that shared, protective silence. The fire crackled, spitting small embers. I keep seeing his face, Delilah said, the confession forced out of her. The man who watched the shack, I close my eyes, and he is there. He will not come up here, Holden said. His voice was flat, certain. Calder's men are town bullies? They are not mountain men. They will not hunt in my territory. My territory. He had claimed the land, and now, by extension, he had claimed her safety. Delilah drank the tea. It was hot, bitter, and bracing. Thank you for my aunt. I have not heard her sleep like that in a year. The air is clean, he said. The silence settled again, this time heavier. It was full of the things they were not saying. What did you lose? She asked, her voice so quiet it was nearly lost in the wind. He tensed. She could see the line of his jaw harden in the firelight. He had not spoken the names aloud in 3 years. He had kept his grief like a stone in his gut. He looked away from the fire, out into the vast, starry darkness over his empty fields. Sarah, he said. The name was a piece of rust, torn from his throat. Delilah waited. She did not breathe. And Thomas, the boy, he was 6 days. He said the names, and the night did not swallow him. The world did not end. He had spoken the unspeakable. I lost the mornings, he said, the words coming easier now, a surprise to him. I lost the sound of someone else in the kitchen, the smell of coffee I did not make. I lost every sound that was not just me or the wind. Delilah closed her eyes. She understood. She knew what it was to be defined by a loss. I lost a name, she whispered, reciprocating his honesty. The name I was supposed to have, Mrs. Amos Crow. She said it, and it tasted like ash. And when I lost that, I lost my own. I was not Delilah anymore. I was the troubled girl, the barren one. Just a whisper. They sat there, the two of them, their ghosts hovering in the cold air between them. He, the man who had lost his future. She, the woman who had been told she had none. The high country wind, cold from the snowfields far above, swept down across the yard. It whipped Delilah's hair, tearing a long, dark strand from the simple bun she wore. The hair lashed across her face, stinging her cheek. She raised a hand to brush it away, but her fingers were numb from the cold. Clumsy. She tried to tuck it back, but it would not hold. Holden watched her. He saw her frustration, her shiver. He hesitated. His hand, resting on his knee, was large, scarred. The knuckles cracked. It was a hand made for axes and ropes. He lifted it. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time to pull away. She saw the hand coming, and she froze. Her breath caught. His fingers, surprisingly warm, brushed her cheek. They were rough, the calluses scraping her skin gently. He did not just push the hair, he gathered the loose strand, his touch impossibly light, and tucked it carefully, securely, behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second, the warmth of his skin against hers, a simple, human contact that felt more profound than any kiss. He pulled his hand back, as if he had touched the fire. He cleared his throat and looked away, back at the flames, his jaw set. The tension on the porch was suddenly as sharp as the air. And then, in the silence, a small, green light drifted between them. A firefly, confused by the autumn cold, drawn to the small, bright fire. It looped once, lazily, and then settled on the wide brim of Holden's hat, right above his eyes. It sat there, and its light flashed. Blink, blink. Delilah's tension snapped. A small, involuntary smile touched her lips. Holden, feeling her gaze, frowned. "What?" "You have she whispered. "A visitor." He reached up, his fingers brushing the insect. It blinked again, illuminating his glove. A low sound rumbled in his chest. It was a chuckle, rough and unused, like an old engine turning over. And hearing it, Delilah laughed. Not the pained, rusty sound from the cabin. This was a true laugh, light and clear, bubbling up from a place of pure, sudden relief. This time Holden did not turn away. He did not flinch. He looked at her, and his eyes the gray, winter sky eyes were soft. The laughter died, but the smile remained, a silent, fragile bridge between them. The cold, dark yard, the threat of Calder, the ghosts of their pasts, they all receded, leaving only the small circle of firelight. The smile faded, and Delilah's fear returned, but it was a different fear, a fear of this intimacy. "Holden," she said, her voice dropping, her hand coming up to rest on her own chest, as if to hold herself together. "The town, when they find out, they will talk. What I am doing here, living in your cabin." She forced herself to meet his eyes, the shame burning her. "I am so afraid," she whispered. "I am so afraid of being seen as merchandise, as something you paid for at the store. And now this, taking me in, as your... His face hardened, but the anger was not for her. It was for the town, for the voices that had labeled her. He did not move closer. He simply held her gaze, his own gaze absolute. "You are not a debt," he said, his voice flat and final. "You are not merchandise." He leaned forward, just an inch. "You are a partner. You are the partner I need to hold this land." The word struck her dumb. Partner. He did not say housekeeper. He did not say friend. He did not say woman. He said partner. The word he would use for a man who worked the fence line with him. The word he would use for an equal. It was a word of respect so profound it undid her. An ache filled her throat, sharp and sudden. A single tear, hot and stinging, escaped and ran down her cold cheek. The grass at their feet was now dark, glistening with dew. The fire was collapsing into a bed of glowing red embers. The night was turning toward morning. Holden stood up. He looked down at her, a tall silhouette against the stars. He held out his hand, not to grab her, not to caress her, to help her up. She looked at his hand for a moment, then placed her own in it. His grip was solid, warm, and sure. He pulled her to her feet, but he did not let go. She was standing in front of him, so close she could feel the heat from his body. She was breathing in the scent of him, sage, wood smoke, and the clean, cold night. He did not release her hand. She did not pull away. He lifted his other arm, his elbow bent, his hand open. It was a clear, silent invitation, a question. She hesitated for one single heartbeat. Then she stepped forward, into the space he offered. His arm came around her, settling on the small of her back. It was awkward. Two people who had forgotten what this was. She was stiff. He was hesitant. It was a light, comforting embrace. Then Delilah let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of pain and relief that seemed to come from her very bones. She let her head rest against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel his heart, a strong, steady, slow beat beneath her ear. At that sound, his embrace tightened. It became real. His large hand spread wide on her back, holding her, sheltering her. She could feel the immense, coiled strength in his arms, a strength he was using only to hold her steady. She was not being grabbed. She was being anchored. She wrapped her own arms around his waist, her hands clutching the rough fabric of his shirt, clinging to him. This was not passion. This was sanctuary. They stood like that for a long time. The only sounds were the dying hiss of the fire and the wind in the high pines. He shifted, pulling back just enough to look down at her face, which was angled up at his. His hand, the one that had held hers, came up to cup her jaw. His thumb, rough as bark, moved, stroking her cheek, gently wiping away the track of that single tear. He looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. He was asking permission. He lowered his head. He moved slowly, giving her every second she needed to turn away. She did not turn. She did not breathe. She rose on her toes, just slightly, to meet him. He pressed his lips, not to hers, but to her forehead. A firm, warm kiss that was a promise of safety. It was a benediction. She closed her eyes, a tremor running through her. He kissed her again, this time on her cheekbone, just below her eye. It was a kiss of tenderness, of awe. His hand never moved from her back, a steady, warm, grounding pressure. There was no urgency in him, no demand. It was the safest she had ever felt in her entire life. She did not want to move. She did not want the embrace to end. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, fitting herself against his side. "We are both broken," she whispered into the collar of his shirt. "Not broken," he murmured, his lips brushing the hair at her temple. "Just dented." A small smile, a real one, touched her mouth. "Tomorrow," she said, the fear still a cold thread. "Tomorrow Voss will know. The town will know. Calder." "Shh," he held her tighter. "We will not let them be tomorrow. Not yet." He pulled back again just enough to look her in the eyes. "We will not let the past define it. Or them. Tomorrow is just work, fences, ledgers. That is all." "A partnership," she whispered, testing the word. "A partnership," he confirmed. He kept one arm around her waist, holding her close to his side. With his free hand, he found hers and laced his fingers through hers, his scarred, calloused skin against her smooth, scraped knuckles. They stood together, a single unit, and turned to look at the glowing embers. Behind them, the window of the cabin was dark, except for the faint, low light of the single lamp Delilah had left burning for her aunt. The curtain was drawn, a small, warm square of yellow against the vast, cold blue of the mountain night. The world, and Calder, and the past it was all outside. But for now, the porch, and the fire, and the silence were theirs. The dawn broke cold and gray, the light thin and weak. Delilah was already in the cabin, her hands in the wash basin, the scent of lye soap sharp in the air. Aunt Elspeth was stirring, her breath catching in a dry cough. Delilah had just set the coffee pot on the stove when the sound began. It was not the wind. It was a low, rhythmic drumming, coming fast from the east. It was the sound of iron-shod hooves on hard-packed earth, a sound of urgency. Holden stepped out of the barn, a bridle in one hand. He looked east. His body went still. "Delilah!" His voice was not a shout. It was a low, sharp command. She was at the door in an instant. She saw them, a cloud of dust on the main trail, resolving itself into 6 riders, moving at a hard canter. "Voss," she breathed. She turned, her eyes wide with panic. The paper, the charcoal copy from the ledger, it was still in her boot. "They will search," she whispered, her mind racing. "They will search me." She looked around the small cabin. The wood box, no. Under the mattress. The first place they would look. Her eyes landed on the large, square wooden bin by the stove. The flour bin. She ran to it, her hands fumbling with the catch. She ripped the folded paper from her boot, her hands shaking. She plunged her arm deep, deep into the cool, soft flour, pushing the paper all the way to the bottom, against the wood. She pulled her arm out, her skin white to the elbow, and smoothed the surface. She slammed the lid just as the riders thundered into the yard. The sound of 6 horses stopping at once was an avalanche of snorts, jangling harness and creaking leather. Holden walked to the center of the yard. He had dropped the bridle. His hands were empty, hanging loose at his sides. Delilah stepped onto the porch, blocking the doorway with her body. Deputy Clayton Voss swung down from his horse. His uniform was brushed, his badge shining in the weak morning light. He looked pleased. The 5 men behind him were not deputies. They were Calder's men, rough-looking hands from the Tin Cup Saloon, each wearing a newly pinned, cheap tin badge. "Holden Pike," Voss called out, unrolling a piece of paper with a flourish. "I have a warrant, signed by Judge Dorn, to search these premises." "Search for what? Voss?" Holden's voice was flat. "Dead. Theft of public property." Voss announced, loud enough for his men to hear, "We have received a sworn complaint that you are illegally diverting public water." Delilah's blood ran cold. They were twisting it. "This spring is deeded," Holden said. "It came with the land. It is mine." Voss smiled, a thin, oily expression. "Not anymore. Pike, the County Water Initiative passed. All high country springs are now a public resource, and you, sir, are stealing from the public." Holden's gaze did not waver. "I have seen no such law posted." He took a step forward. "I want to see the law. Voss, the one signed and sealed by the legislature. Not your warrant, the law." Voss's smile faltered for a second. "The law is not your concern. The warrant is. Now stand aside. You." He pointed at Delilah. "Get out of the doorway." "You will not upset my aunt," Delilah said, her voice trembling but fierce. "She is a sick woman." "I will do as the law demands." Voss sneered. He shoved past her, his shoulder knocking her hard against the doorframe. "Delilah!" Holden roared, taking a step, but 2 of the new deputies leveled their rifles at his chest. Voss and 2 other men burst into the small cabin. The sound was brutal. They upended the table. They tore the blankets from Elspeth's bed, leaving the old woman clutching her thin nightgown, her eyes wide with terror. "Nothing here!" one man yelled, kicking over the wood box. Delilah watched, her heart in her throat. As the second man approached the flour bin, he put his hand on the lid. "What is in here, girl?" he grunted. "Flour," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He lifted the lid, looked at the smooth white surface, and snorted. "Flour." He slammed the lid shut and turned away, sweeping the contents of the mantel Holden's single cup, the tin of coffee, onto the floor. Delilah let out a breath she did not know she was holding. Voss stormed back out, his face dark. "It is not in the cabin. Check the barn. Check the spring head. Find the diversion pipe." "There is no pipe," Holden said. "We will see." They were forced to march up the small hill to the spring that bubbled from a rock fissure. 2 men stayed behind, their rifles trained on Holden. One of Voss's men, the one who had looked in the flour bin, was already at the spring, poking in the mud. "Well, well, boss," the man shouted, a note of false discovery in his voice. "What is this?" He reached into the reeds and pulled out a bright, shiny object, caked in fresh mud. It was a metal cylinder, painted yellow, with county markings, a survey marker. "He dug it up," Voss said, his voice triumphant. "He dug up the county marker to hide his theft." Holden stared at the object. "I have never seen that before." "Tell it to the judge," Voss said. He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. "Holden Pike, you are under arrest for theft of county property and tampering with official markers. Your hands." This was the trap. Not a slow foreclosure, a fast arrest, with Holden in jail. Calder could seize the land as evidence and begin work on his aqueduct immediately. The deputies holstered their rifles and advanced on Holden. Holden looked at Delilah. His eyes were not panicked. They were cold, calculating. He gave her a look that said, "Now." He spoke, his voice low and fast. For her ears only, dry gulch, the old deed marker, a split rock. What was that? Pike, Voss snapped. Holden moved. It was not a punch. It was a release of pure, coiled energy. He spun, not at Voss, but at the two deputies. He drove his shoulder into the chest of the first man, using his own forward momentum against him. The man flew backward into the second deputy. "Run," Holden roared at Delilah. He grabbed her hand and pulled her. They were not running to the cabin. They were running to the barn. A shot cracked the air. One of the deputies, untangling himself, fired his pistol, the bullet whining past Holden's ear. They crashed through the barn door. The two horses they had ridden were still in their stalls, saddles on, bridles off. "No time!" Holden yelled. He grabbed a hackamore from a peg and shoved it onto his horse's head. He threw a rope halter onto Delilah's mare. "Get on no saddle, just go." He slapped her mare hard on the rump. The horse leaped forward. Holden swung onto his own horse's bare back. They burst out the wide-open back of the barn. A charge of two, crashing through a low-slung rope corral. Voss and his men were scrambling for their own horses, shouting in confusion. "Do not let them get away! Shoot them! Shoot them!" Voss was screaming, his voice high and thin. Holden and Delilah were flat against their horses' necks. They were not riding east, toward town. They were riding hard west, toward the canyons, the wind tearing at their hair. Gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets snapped the air around them, kicking up dust at their horses' feet. This was not an arrest. This was a hunt. "This way!" Holden yelled, veering into a dry wash, the high red walls rising on either side. "They are coming!" Delilah screamed. She could hear the thunder of 6 horses behind them, closing the gap. "It is rougher up here. They do not know the trail," Holden shouted back. They wove through a maze of boulders, the horses scrambling, their hooves striking sparks on the rock. The canyon walls narrowed. The gulch was a trap. "Holden, it is a dead end," Delilah cried, pulling back on her rope. A sheer wall of rock rose 20 feet in front of them. "Not a dead end up," Holden pointed. A narrow game trail, barely a foot wide, cut up the side of the canyon wall. "You first go," he yelled. Delilah's mare scrambled, her iron shoes slipping on the scree. She clawed her way to the top. Holden was right behind her. They reached the rim of the canyon just as Voss and his men thundered into the dead end below. "They are trapped. Spread out. Find them." Voss's voice echoed up. Holden pulled Delilah from her horse. They lay flat on the rock, chests heaving, watching the men below scatter. "They will find the trail," Holden whispered, his voice grim. "They will be up here in 5 minutes. Delilah looked around, her mind frantic. They were on a high, bare mesa. No cover. To the south, miles away, she saw a faint cloud of brown dust. Cattle. She stared, shielding her eyes from the high sun. She knew this view. "Holden, that is Martha Ellery's south pasture. That is her herd." Holden looked. "She is moving them to high ground. It does not help us." "Maybe it does." Delilah scrambled back to her mare, ripping her saddlebag from the horse's side. She tore it open, tossing out her mending kit. Her fingers closed on the small, steel signal mirror she kept for emergencies. "What are you doing?" "Aunt Elspeth taught me," Delilah said, her voice tight, "how to signal for help." She stood, angling the mirror. The sun caught it, sending a beam of blinding white light across the plains. She aimed it at the distant dust cloud. "Flash! Flash, flash, flash! The signal for danger. Flash! Flash, flash, flash!" "They will not see it," Holden said. "They will," she insisted. She kept flashing, her hand steady. Below, a shout. "Up here I found the trail." "Keep their heads down." Holden pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard and fired a single shot over the heads of the men in the gulch. They scattered for cover. "Delilah, it is not working." We have to ride. Wait, she breathed. Look. The dust cloud to the south was no longer drifting. It was billowing. It was changing direction. What is that? Holden whispered. That, Delilah said, a wild, terrified smile on her face, is Martha's prize bull. He hates flashes of light. He thinks it is lightning. He is running. The distant dust cloud was now a roaring, oncoming wave. The sound began, a low rumble that vibrated in their bones. Get down, Holden said, pulling her to the ground. The sound became a roar. The ground shook. Martha Ellery's herd, 200 head of longhorn cattle, spooked by the flashing light and led by a panicked, 1-ton bull, thundered past the mouth of Dry Gulch. It was a sea of dust, horns, and bellowing panic. Voss and his men, just starting their climb, were caught. The canyon filled with a wall of stampeding cattle. Men were screaming. Horses, terrified, reared and bolted. It was pure, terrifying chaos. Now, Holden said, his voice grim. He grabbed Delilah and threw her onto her mare. We ride, not west, back to town, as fast as God will let us. They did not use the trail. They plunged their horses over the side of the mesa, sliding down a steep dirt incline, and hit the flats at a dead run. They did not look back. They rode into Sagebrush Crossing an hour later. They were not just dirty. They were coated in sweat and dust, their horses lathered, their lungs burning. They did not stop. They rode straight to the courthouse and fell from their horses. They burst through the double doors. Judge Silas Dorn was at his bench, reading Mr. Harlan Yates was at his clerk's desk, writing in a ledger. Mr. Pike, what is the meaning of this interruption? The judge boomed, looking over his spectacles. I am told you are a fugitive. We are not fugitives, Your Honor, Delilah said, stepping forward. Her voice was hoarse, but it did not break. We are the victims. Judge Dorn's eyes widened. Miss Quinn, you are. I am Mr. Pike's bookkeeper, and I have proof that the warrant you signed was based on a lie. Proof, the judge said, his voice suddenly sharp. Voss and Calder are stealing from the county, Delilah said, walking directly to the bench. Mr. Yates, please retrieve the Road and Bridge Fund ledger and the private proposal for the aqueduct, the one with the map. Yates, his face pale and beaded with sweat, looked at the judge, who nodded. Yates scurried to the shelf. Your Honor, Delilah said, a few days ago, I copied the disbursement page from the Road and Bridge Fund. She bent down, pulled up her skirt to her ankle, and retrieved the flour-dusted paper from her boot. The judge's jaw dropped. She smoothed the paper and placed it on the bench. These are payments, listed as advances, made to Deputy Voss from the county fund, authorized by Ephraim Calder. This is a copy, the judge began. Now, sir, please look at the signature on the official fund ledger and compare it to the signature on Mr. Calder's private aqueduct proposal. Yates laid the two massive books on the bench, side by side. Judge Dorn looked at the first signature. He looked at the second. He looked back at the first. Mr. Yates, the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. You are an expert on these matters. Your opinion. Harlan Yates visibly trembled. He adjusted his spectacles. He peered at the two signatures for a long, silent minute. Your Honor, Yates squeaked, his voice cracking. The signature on the private proposal is fluid, complex. The one on the fund, it is simpler. It is cruder. It is, in my opinion, sir, it is a forgery, a trace. Someone copied Mr. Calder's simpler signature to authorize the withdrawals. The room was so quiet. The buzz of a fly was a roar. He is using county money to pay his men, Delilah pressed. And those men are planting evidence to seize Mr. Pike's land under the guise of a law that has not even been voted on. The courthouse door slammed open. Voss stood there, his uniform caked in dust and something worse. His face was a mask of pure fury.
"Judge, these fugitives resisted arrest. They endangered my men, I demand."
"Silence," Judge Dorn roared, slamming his gavel. Voss stopped, shocked. "Deputy Voss," the judge said, his voice like granite. "I am issuing an immediate stay on this warrant. Furthermore, I am issuing a temporary injunction halting all activity, surveying or otherwise, related to the aqueduct proposal, pending a full criminal investigation."
But the evidence, the marker,"
Voss stammered. "The only evidence I see," Judge Dorn said, his voice like ice, "is a forgery and malfeasance in your department. You will return to your office. You will file a report on today's stampede. You will not go within 1 mile of Mr. Pike's property. You will not speak to Miss Quinn. Am I understood?" Voss's face was a mottled purple. He stared, not at the judge, but at Delilah. His look was a promise of violence.
"This," he hissed, "is not over."
He turned and slammed the door behind him. Judge Dorn looked at Holden and Delilah. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You two, go home. Try to stay out of trouble." They stumbled out into the bright, sharp sunlight. Delilah leaned against a post, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. The world was spinning. Holden stood beside her. He was watching the street, watching for Voss's return. He did not touch her. After a long minute, he spoke, his voice rough. "The mirror, with the sun and the books." He shook his head. A small, stunned movement. He looked down at his own large, empty hands, then at her. "You," he said, his voice low, "for her alone. You are braver than 100 guns." The injunction was a line drawn in the dust, not a wall of stone. Holden and Delilah returned to Blue Willow Ranch, but the victory felt thin, brittle. They had won a pause, not the war. The entire town was holding its breath, waiting to see which way Calder would strike next. He did not use fists, he used the sky. The small victory at the courthouse was followed by 6 weeks of brutal, unbroken sun. The spring thaw, which had promised so much, dried to a memory. The creeks shrank. The grass on the low plains turned from green to pale yellow, then to a brittle, dusty brown. The wind, when it blew, was not a relief. It was a hot breath from an oven, carrying the grit that choked the lungs and stung the eyes. Drought settled over Sagebrush Crossing like a shroud. The first well to go was the communal one in Mesquite Hollow. It had always been shallow, fed by runoff. Now, the women who went to it found their buckets coming up with only a few inches of Brack's stinking mud. Within a week, the fever started. It began with the children in the hollow. A dry, rasping cough, a skin that burned to the touch, a thirst that could not be slaked. The laudanum Delilah bought was no longer for her aunt's pain. It was to quiet the coughs of 6 children crammed into the stifling, airless shacks. Holden's spring, high on the mountain, was the only clean water source for miles. It was not public, not yet. The injunction held, but it was his. He began hauling water. Every morning, he would fill 4 large barrels, load them onto the buckboard, and drive them to the edge of the hollow. He and Delilah would distribute it. 1 bucket per family, per day. It was not enough. Ephraim Calder watched, and he waited. He let the thirst and the fear ripen. When the fever claimed the first child, a 2-year-old boy named Thomas, the same name as Holden's lost son Calder, made his move. He did not come himself. He sent his men, led by a tight-lipped Voss, to post notices all over town. The notice was simple. In the interest of public health, Mr. Ephraim Calder was offering temporary water relief. He would open his private reserves, the ones he had already been hoarding, to any family in need. The cost was minimal. All they had to do was sign a paper. The paper was a lien against their property, their wagon, their tools, whatever meager possessions they had. It gave Calder the right to seize their assets if the water debt was not repaid, with interest, within 30 days. It was not a lifeline, it was a noose. "He is buying their land with water," Delilah said, her voice shaking with fury. She held the notice in her hand. Having torn it from the trading post wall, they were back at the ranch, the sun setting, casting a sickly orange light. "He is offering what they need," Holden said, his voice flat. He was staring at the small, fresh grave he could see from his porch. "We are giving them water," Delilah protested. "We are giving them a bucket." Holden said, "He is offering a flood. A sick child does not care about a signature. Delilah, only about the thirst." "We cannot let him do this." She crumpled the notice in her fist. "He is using that little boy's death." "We cannot stop him," Holden said, the exhaustion clear in his voice. "He has the law, and now he has the thirst." "No." Delilah's voice was quiet, but the iron was back. "No, we cannot give them more water, but we can give them something else." She went into the cabin. She returned with her ledger, the one she kept for the ranch, and her own small, battered journal. "If they are sick, they are hungry," she said. "The men are not working. They are nursing their families. We have flour. Holden, you have potatoes in the root cellar." "It is not enough for the whole hollow," he said. "It is enough for a start," she said. "We will not let them starve. If they are weak, they will sign his paper. If they have food, maybe they can fight." The next morning, they did not just bring water. They brought a massive iron kettle, potatoes, onions, and half a side of bacon. Delilah built a fire in the center of Mesquite Hollow, away from the shacks. The women came first, drawn by the smell. Their faces were pinched, their eyes hollow with fear and grief. "This is not charity," Delilah announced, her voice ringing in the still, hot air. She stood on a crate. "This is a community. We cook together, we eat together, and we keep track." She opened the ledger. "Martha Ellery, you have chickens. We need broth. You will be credited. Mrs. Sims, you have salt. We need salt." It was a barter system. She was not giving soup. She was organizing a soup kitchen. She made them partners. She gave them back their dignity. 1 onion at 8 a.m. The women, who had been isolated in their own terror, began to work. They brought their meager stores. They chopped, they stirred, they argued over the salt. It was the first normal, human sound the hollow had heard in weeks. Delilah ladled the first bowl herself, for the mother who had lost her son. The woman drank it, tears streaming down her face, and it was the first nourishment she had taken in 2 days. Delilah stayed. Holden brought the water and the heavy supplies. Then he left, a silent guardian. Delilah remained in the hollow, running the kitchen, sleeping in her old shack beside her aunt, who was now being cared for by 3 other women. She was organizing more than food. She was organizing a rebellion. On the 3rd day, a shadow fell over the soup kettle. Prudence Banner. The store owner looked haggard. Her black dress was dusty. She looked at the steaming kettle, at the long line of women and children, and at Delilah, who stood by the ledger, her face smudged with soot. "They are calling you the Soup Queen," Prudence said, her voice dry. "It is better than the troubled girl," Delilah replied, not looking up. Prudence stood there for a long time. The injunction had frozen Calder's accounts, and her black ledger, the one he had financed, was now a liability. She was exposed. "He came to me," Prudence whispered, her voice tight. "Calder, he said if I did not find a way to discredit you, to shut this down, he would call my notes. He would ruin me. He said he would burn me out." Delilah finally looked up.
Why are you telling me this?
Prudence's hands were shaking. She reached into her reticule. She pulled out a small, oilcloth-wrapped packet. "Because I am a businesswoman," Prudence said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "And he made a bad deal. He threatened me. No one threatens my store." She shoved the packet into Delilah's hand.
These are not copies. These are the originals, the real receipts from his freight office. The ones that prove he has been billing the county for aqueduct supplies for 6 months. He is not just planning a theft. Miss Quinn, he has already done it.
Delilah's fingers closed around the packet. The paper was real. This was not a charcoal copy. This was the weapon.
Why?
Delilah asked, stunned. "You get me out from under his thumb," Prudence said, her eyes hard. "You get me immunity from the judge. You use these, you destroy him, and I will burn that black ledger in the street." Prudence turned and walked away, her back straight, never looking back. Delilah held the receipts. She had the truth, but the fever was still raging. She ran, not to the courthouse, but to the doctor's office. The receipts were useless if the children died. Doctor, Elias Cole was an old man, weary to his bones. "Truth is not a medicine. Delilah," he said when she burst in. "I need quinine. I need bandages. I have nothing." "What will it cost?" she asked. He wrote a number on a piece of paper. It was staggering. It was more money than the entire Hollow would see in a decade. She ran to the ranch. She found Holden in the west pasture. He was not mending fences. He was looking at his spring calf crop. 50 head of new, healthy calves, the only profit he would see all year. Delilah did not have to say a word. She just held out the doctor's paper. Holden read it. He looked at the calves. He looked at the trail leading down to Sagebrush Crossing, where the fever was. He looked at the fresh grave he had dug for the first child. "Drive them," he said, his voice a rasp. "Holden, no, this is everything. This is your whole year. This is the tax money." "It is just beef," he said, his voice harsh to cover the break in it. "They are just animals. Those are children." He rode to the cattle broker's office that afternoon. He sold the entire crop for half their value. A fever sale. He took the cash, not a bank draft. He gave all of it, every last dollar, to Dr. Cole. "Buy the quinine," he said, and walked out. Calder heard of the sale within the hour. He heard that the medicine wagon was on its way. He saw his leverage, the thirst, the sickness evaporating. He was losing control. That night, the ranch was attacked. Delilah had returned with Holden, too exhausted to move. They were in the cabin, Aunt Elspeth asleep. The two of them sitting at the small table, the packet of original receipts between them. The first rock hit the window. It did not just crack the glass, it shattered it, spraying the room with cold night air and sharp fragments. Holden blew out the lamp in an instant, plunging the room into darkness. "Get down! Get your aunt!" Delilah dragged Elspeth from the bed, rolling her under it, covering her with her own body. Holden was at the shattered window, his rifle in his hand. He did not fire. Another rock hit the door, a heavy, splintering thud. A third crashed through the other window. Voices shouted from the darkness, muffled and ugly. "Rancher, get out of our valley. Water thief. Leave the girl. Pike. We will take care of her." Holden's hand tightened on the rifle. Delilah, huddled under the bed, her arms around her terrified, moaning aunt, felt a cold, clear rage, a rage that burned brighter than any fear. She scrambled out. "Delilah, get down," Holden hissed.
"They are not here for you,"
she said, her voice shaking.
"They are here for me, for this."
She grabbed the packet of receipts from the table. She walked to the shattered doorway. "Stop." Holden grabbed her arm. "No," she said, and her voice was a command. "Your way is the rifle, my way is the ledger." She stepped onto the porch, into the moonlight. Holden was right behind her, his rifle raised, a dark silhouette. There were 5 of them. Calder's men, the same ones from the saloon. They held rocks in their hands, their faces ugly in the moonlight.
Well, well, look who is here, one of them sneered. The little whore herself.
I have what you want, Delilah said. She held up the packet. These are the originals, the ones that will hang Calder. The men stopped. This, they understood.
Give them to us, girl, the man said, dropping his rock.
You came here to scare us, Delilah said, her voice carrying in the cold, still air. You came to silence a barren woman, a troubled girl. You think I am a debt. You think I am a bill to be settled. She took a step forward. My name is Delilah Quinn, and I am not a bill to be settled. She saw movement in the shadows behind the men, the people of Mesquite Hollow. They had heard the riders. They had followed. They were standing at the edge of the yard. A silent, gaunt audience, armed with sticks and old pitchforks. Delilah looked at them. She looked at the men in front of her. She unrolled her own battered journal, the one she had kept in the hollow. I wrote this, she said, her voice ringing out. 2 months ago, no one is useless in the wind. No one is a bill to be settled. You are just the men who collect the debts. But he, she pointed to Holden, he is the man who pays them. He paid his profit, his taxes, his entire year to buy medicine for your children. The men in the yard shifted. They looked at each other.
She is lying, one of Calder's men yelled.
The medicine wagon is on the road, Delilah said. It will be here by morning, because of him. Who is your master? Ephraim Calder, paying for only himself. A small boy, not more than 7, thin as a rail, his face pale with fever, stepped out from the crowd. He walked right up to the porch. He looked up at Delilah, his eyes huge in the moonlight. Are you anybody's ma? Delilah's breath caught. The question, the one she had dreaded her entire life. She knelt, right there on the porch, ignoring the broken glass. She was level with his eyes. No, honey, she said, her voice soft and fierce. I am the one keeping your supper warm. The boy's mother, Martha Ellery, stepped forward, her face a mask of grief and fury. She looked at Calder's men. He is right, Martha said, her voice low. My children are sick, and you come here to throw rocks. Get off this land. Get off his land. The crowd from the hollow surged forward, a silent, angry wave. Calder's men, facing not just Holden's rifle, but 20 angry, desperate parents, faltered. They backed away. They dropped their rocks. They mounted their horses and fled into the night. Holden lowered the rifle. He looked at Delilah, who was still kneeling, her hand on the small boy's shoulder. He saw her, not as the victim from the store, but as a general. He watched her gently guide the boy back to his mother. He saw her stand up, clutching the receipts in one hand and her journal in the other. The fire that had been in his chest by the porch that night, the one he had thought was memory, was real. It was not a ghost. It was the woman standing in front of him, covered in glass and moonlight. The community, her community, gathered around the porch. It is not over, Delilah told them, her voice full of a new, cold power. He will not stop. He will make his last move, and we will be ready for it. Ephraim Calder's final move was not made with rocks in the night. It was made with an open hand in the light of day. He called a town meeting. The fever had broken, thanks to Holden's calves and the wagon load of quinine. The drought, however, held fast. The town was weak, grateful, and terrified of what came next. They gathered, not at the courthouse, but at the old, decommissioned train depot. It was the only building large enough to hold the entire, fractured community. The air inside was stale, smelling of old iron and dry rot. The building was packed, the poor from Mesquite Hollow, their faces still gaunt. stood in the back. The merchants and ranchers, including a nervous Martha Ellery, sat on the baggage carts. In the front row sat Reverend Crow, his hands folded, his face a mask of civic concern. Judge Dorn presided, his face grim. Ephraim Calder stood at the front, his thumbs hooked in his waistcoat. He was not the angry, thwarted man from the courthouse. He was a benefactor. "My friends," Calder began, his voice booming with false warmth. "We have been through a trial, sickness, drought, fear." He nodded toward the hollow residents. "But we are a community. We endure, and now we must build." He paused, letting the silence hang. "The railroad is our future, and the railroad needs water. This aqueduct," he gestured to a large, newly drawn map, "is not just water for steam engines. It is a river of prosperity. It is life." He then turned, his gaze falling on Reverend Crow. "But what is prosperity?" Calder said, his voice dropping to a pious tone. "Without a soul, our church, our beloved church, the roof leaks, the pews are split." Reverend Crow nodded, his expression mournful. "I make this pledge today." Calder announced, "The moment this town votes to approve the aqueduct, the moment we secure the land for the main holding tank, I will personally finance a new roof, new pews, and a new stained glass window for the house of God." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a brilliant move. He was not just offering water, he was offering salvation. He was offering to heal the town's soul in exchange for one small piece of land. Reverend Crow stood up. "Mr. Calder, this is a sign of profound generosity, a sign of faith." Calder nodded. "I only ask," he said, his voice hardening as he looked toward the back, "that this town not let one selfish man stand in the way of God's work and our future." All eyes turned to the back door, where Holden Pike stood, his arms crossed. He had not come to speak. He had come to watch. "One man," Calder repeated, "who stubbornly holds the one piece of land we need for the tank. One man who would see this town wither, who would see that church crumble, all for his own selfish pride." The crowd was turning. They looked at Holden with new suspicion. "Now," Judge Dorn said, his voice heavy, "we must put the matter of the injunction to a public vote." "Wait." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the depot like a clean, cold knife. The crowd parted. Delilah Quinn walked down the center aisle. She was not alone. On her right walked Prudence Banner, clutching her black ledger. On her left walked Mr. Harlan Yates, his arms full of official county ledgers. Delilah did not look like the soup queen. She did not look like the troubled girl. She was wearing her one good dress, pressed and clean. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fire. She walked past Holden without looking at him. She stopped directly in front of Judge Dorn's table. Calder's smile froze. Voss, standing by the wall, put his hand on his pistol. "Miss Quinn," Judge Dorn said, his voice sharp, "this is an official proceeding. I am here to provide official testimony, Your Honor." Delilah said. She took Prudence's black book and set it on the table with a solid thud. "This," she said to the crowd, "is Mrs. Banner's ledger. It shows every free sack of flour, every loan given to the families of Mesquite Hollow, and next to each name is the request from Mr. Calder that they vote yes today." A gasp went through the Hollow residents. Prudence Banner, her face like stone, looked at Calder and said, "I will not be threatened. Ephraim, my books are now open. I seek immunity in exchange for my testimony." Calder chuckled. "A shopkeeper's gossip. Is that all you have? Girl, a book of debts?" "No," Delilah said. She took the official freight receipts from her basket the originals Prudence had given her and laid them out. "I also have these, the original invoices from your freight office. Mr. Calder."
The ones proving you have been billing the county road and bridge fund for pipe, for cement, and for wire, for your private aqueduct, for 6 months. The crowd erupted. "Thief!" someone yelled from the back.
Voss stepped forward. "That is a lie. Those invoices are for county road improvements. I authorized them myself."
"Did you?"
Delilah said, her voice dropping, turning to the deputy.
"Or did you simply trace his name?"
She turned to Mr.
Yates.
"Mr. Yates, please bring the road and bridge fund ledger and Mr. Calder's private aqueduct proposal." Yates, trembling but resolute, placed the two massive books side by side. "You have all seen the forgery of the signature," Delilah said to the judge. "We spoke of this, but I ask you to look closer. Not at the signature, at the ink." She pointed to the forged signature on the county ledger. "Mr. Yates, you are a man of paper and pen. What do you see?" Calder's face had gone pale. He was watching Yates. Yates adjusted his spectacles. He peered, his nose nearly touching the paper. "Your Honor." Yates squeaked, but his voice was clear. "A man signing his own name. He moves with speed. The ink flows. A man copying a name. He is slow. He is careful." He pointed with a thin, ink-stained finger. "Look, at the top of the E, and here, at the loop of the C, the ink is pooled. It is a blot. The pen nib has dug into the paper. This is not a man signing. This is a man drawing. This," he said, his voice rising with the righteous indignation of a man who has found a fatal error, "is the most labored, amateurish trace I have ever had the misfortune to witness." A deathly silence fell over the room. The technicality, the simple, physical proof of the ink blot, was more damning than any accusation. Voss was finished. His denial died in his throat. The crowd looked at Calder. His mask of piety was gone. His face was a mask of cold, reptilian fury. It was Reverend Crowe who broke the silence. He stood, his Bible in his hand. He looked, not at Calder, but at his son, Amos, who was standing near the wall, his face a picture of misery. Let us not be hasty," the Reverend began, his voice weak, grasping. "This is a time for forgiveness, for community. Let him who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. These are terrible accusations. But Mr. Calder has promised to heal our church." His voice trailed off. The hypocrisy was too thick. He had tried to save his son, to save the church's new roof, and he had failed. He sat down, his face in his hands. The crowd began to shout, "Thief! Liar! Arrest him!" Holden Pike finally moved. He walked down the aisle, past Delilah, until he stood beside Calder. He was not looking at Calder. He was looking at the crowd, at Martha Ellery, at the faces from the hollow. He only said one thing. His voice was not loud, but it silenced the room. "My land," he said, "feeds people, not lies." He turned and looked at Calder. That was all. The contrast was absolute. Calder, who had offered a false promise to God in exchange for theft, and Holden, who had given his entire livelihood, his real wealth, to save the town's children. The vote was over before it began. Judge Dorn stood. He slammed his gavel, the sound like a gunshot in the tense room. "This meeting is adjourned," he boomed. "Based on the physical evidence presented by Miss Quinn, Mrs. Banner, and Clerk Yates, I am hereby ordering a full criminal investigation into Ephraim Calder and Deputy Clayton Voss for forgery, embezzlement of public funds, and conspiracy." Voss tried to move, but two ranchers, men who had known Holden for years, stepped in front of him. "Furthermore," the judge yelled, "I am placing all accounts of the Road and Bridge Fund and all private assets of Mr. Calder under the seal of this court, pending investigation. The aqueduct proposal is dead." He pointed to Voss. "Deputy, you are relieved of duty.
Hand me your badge.
Calder did not move. He simply stared at Delilah. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. The crowd surged, a wave of relief and anger. They flooded the aisle. In the chaos, a figure pushed through, grabbing Delilah's arm. Amos Crow. His handsome face was crumpled, desperate. "Delilah," he pleaded, his voice hurried. "You were magnificent. I was a fool, a child. I see that now. My father, he was wrong. Please, come back to me." Delilah looked at him, at the man whose rejection had defined her, had broken her, had sent her to the hollow. She looked at his weak, desperate face. He was not trying to win her back. He was trying to attach himself to her power. She pulled her arm from his grasp, slowly, gently. "I am no longer your roomer, Amos," she said, her voice soft, and as final as a closing door. She turned away from him, leaving him standing alone in the crowd. The surge of people pushed her. She was exhausted, her legs weak from adrenaline and relief. She stumbled over a loose floorboard. She started to fall. Before she hit the ground, a hand grabbed her. It was not a violent grab. It was a solid, anchoring grip on her arm. "Holden." He pulled her upright, steadying her. She was leaning against him, her head for a moment against his chest. She looked up at him. He did not smile. He just looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers. He did not let go of her arm. His hand was warm, solid. As she regained her balance, his hand slid down her forearm and his fingers closed over her hand. It was not a lover's caress. It was a public declaration. It was the grip of a partner. It was the touch he had offered on the porch, now brought into the light of day, in front of the entire town. He held her hand for a second longer than was necessary, a second that stretched, full of unspoken promises. Then he released his grip, his hand falling to his side, but he did not move away. He stood beside her, a shield against the crowd, ready to walk her home. They returned to the ranch as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The victory in the depot was a heavy, exhausting thing. It was an end, but not yet a peace. Holden was quiet on the ride, his eyes scanning the ridges, still wary. Delilah sat beside him, the original receipts tucked safely in her basket, her body vibrating with the aftermath of the confrontation. He pulled the wagon into the yard and stopped. The air was wrong. For months, the air had been hot, dry, and thin. Now, it was heavy, thick. The wind had died, and the silence that fell was absolute, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The sky was not dark, but a low, oppressive, yellowish gray. Holden stepped down from the buckboard, his head tilted, sniffing the air. It smelled, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, of damp earth and ozone. Delilah, halfway to the cabin to check on her aunt, froze. A single, fat drop of water hit the dusty ground by her foot. It did not soak in. It sat on the hard-packed alkali dirt like a bead of mercury. Another drop hit the tin roof of the porch. The sound was as loud and sharp as a hammer blow. And then the sky tore open. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a roar, a sudden, violent, cleansing flood, as if a dam had broken in the heavens. The water fell in solid, cold sheets. In 10 seconds, the yard turned from a dust bowl to a running river of mud. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of the drought, the fever, and the fear finally breaking. Holden, who had been moving to unhitch the team, stopped and just stood in it, his face turned to the sky, letting the water plaster his hair to his skull. Then he yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar, "The hay!" He had moved the last of the cut hay to the troughs in the lower pasture. It was their winter feed, all they had left. Delilah did not hesitate. She was his partner. She ran. She was soaked to the skin before she had taken 5 steps. The cold water was a shock. Stealing her breath, she met him at the barn. He was wrestling with a massive, heavy canvas tarp.
"Grab an end!" he shouted.
Together, they dragged it out into the storm. The wind had come up, a driving, horizontal blast that turned the rain to stinging needles. The tarp became a sail, ripping at their hands, trying to tear free.
"Holden, I cannot hold it!"
she screamed, her feet sliding in the new, slick mud. He roared, a wordless sound of pure effort, and threw his entire body onto one corner. They wrestled the heavy, sodden canvas over the troughs, the rain hammering down, the wind howling. Delilah slipped, falling to her knees in 6 inches of cold, running water and mud. Her carefully pinned hair, the hair she had fixed for the depot, came undone, falling in a long, wet rope down her back. Holden saw her fall. He grabbed the last tie-down, looping it through the fence rail. He turned and hauled her to her feet, his hands under her arms. They stood there, braced against the wind, side by side. The hay was covered. They were an absolute mess. He was bareheaded, his hat long gone, his hair plastered to his face. His shirt was translucent, clinging to the hard muscles of his chest. Mud was splattered to his waist. She was just as bad. Her dress, her one good dress, was ruined, heavy and dark with water, mud clinging to the hem. Her hair was a wild tangle. They looked at each other. The proper rancher and the prim bookkeeper were gone. All that was left were 2 drowned, muddy creatures, shivering in the center of a storm. A bubble of laughter, hysterical and wild, rose in Delilah's throat. She looked at his serious, mud-streaked face, and she laughed. It was not a giggle. It was a full, unrestrained, freeing sound, a laugh that came from the very bottom of her soul, lost in the roar of the rain. Holden stared at her. He saw her, not as the troubled girl or the soup queen, but as this vital, laughing, soaked creature. The winter in his eyes, the gray, frozen shield, finally melted. A deep sound rumbled in his chest. He laughed, too, a rough, stunned, deep laugh that joined hers. They stood in the middle of the deluge, holding onto a muddy fence post, and laughed until their sides ached.
"We are fools,"
he shouted over the wind.
"We are alive,"
she shouted back. The cold finally cut through. A shudder ran through her, so violent it was visible. The laughter stopped.
"You are freezing,"
Holden said, his voice instantly grim.
"Get to the barn, now."
He did not guide her to the cabin, where her aunt was sleeping. He pulled her toward his space. The barn. They stumbled inside, into the relative quiet. The roar of the rain on the roof was a deep, drumming sound, sealing them off from the world. It was dark, the only light coming from the open door. It smelled of dry hay, warm animals, and leather. Holden slammed the heavy door shut, plunging them into near blackness. Delilah shivered, her teeth chattering, her wet dress clinging to her like ice. She heard him strike a match. The small flame flared, and he touched it to the wick of a lantern. A warm, amber light filled the space. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the soft, curious eyes of the horses in their stalls. And it illuminated them. They were standing in a pool of water and mud on the barn floor, their breath plumed in front of them, visible as white clouds in the cold, damp air.
"Get that dress off,"
he said. His voice was not suggestive. It was a harsh, practical command. "You will be sick." She just stood there, her fingers numb, unable to move. He turned his back to her, a gesture of profound, instinctive respect. "I will not look." He went to a tack box and pulled out 2 heavy, clean horse blankets, the thick wool smelling faintly of cedar. He kept his back to her. Delilah, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely work the buttons, unfastened the bodice. The wet dress, heavy as lead, fell to her ankles. She stood in her thin, soaked chemise and petticoat, shivering violently.
I am decent, she whispered.
He turned. He held one of the heavy blankets open, like a cloak. He did not look at her body. He looked at her face. He stepped forward and wrapped the blanket around her, enveloping her. His hands were rough, but his movements were sure. He tucked the wool under her chin, cocooning her. He wrapped the other blanket around his own shoulders. They stood in the golden light of the lantern, the rain drumming a lullaby on the roof, the storm, the town, Calder, Voss. It was all outside. It could not touch them. "Your face," he said, his voice low and rough. She put a hand to her cheek. It was streaked with mud and wet hair. He found a clean, dry rag on a shelf. He stepped closer. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body through the wet wool of his own blanket. He did not hand her the rag. He lifted it. His eyes asked permission. She nodded, just once. His hand, scarred and calloused, came up. He gently, almost awkwardly, began to dab the mud from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, unbelievably soft. He was rough by nature, but he was being careful, as if he were tending a wound. He wiped the water from her temple. He cleared a strand of wet hair from her forehead. His fingers brushed her skin. She was so cold. His hand was so warm. When he was done, he did not pull his hand away. He cupped her jaw, his thumb resting on her cold cheekbone. Delilah's breath hitched, her chattering teeth stilled. Without thinking, she leaned into his touch, turning her face into his palm, pressing her cold cheek against his warm, rough skin. She closed her eyes. It was the safest thing she had ever felt. It was an anchor in the storm. Holden's breath stopped. He watched her, this brave, impossible woman, nestle against his hand like a trusting animal. He brought his other hand up, resting it on the side of her head, his fingers tangling in her damp hair. He lowered his own head until his forehead rested against hers. They stood like that, in the amber light, breathing in the same small space, their breath mingling. "The cornbread," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that she felt more than heard. "This morning, you burned it. The bottom was black." A small, shaky laugh escaped her.
"You let that new mare," she whispered back, "walk all over you. She is the most stubborn animal I have ever seen."
"She is smart," he murmured, his lips moving against her hair. "You are a terrible liar," she breathed. The intimacy of the small, absurd truths, the details of their shared life, was more profound than the embrace on the porch. This was not sanctuary. This was home.
"I dream," she confessed, her voice thick, "of a plum orchard down by the creek, rows of them. I always have. It is so foolish."
His hand tightened in her hair.
"No,"
he whispered. "It is not foolish. We will order the saplings in the spring. He pulled his head back, just enough to see her. Her eyes were open, wide and dark in the lantern light. Her lips were pale, parted. He looked at her mouth. This time, he did not hesitate. This time, he was not asking. He was answering. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the chaste, protective kiss he had given her on the forehead. It was slow, and it was certain. His lips were chapped, but warm. He did not demand. He simply took. It was a kiss of infinite relief, of a long thirst finally slaked. It tasted of rain and salt and the faint, clean scent of the sage he drank. Delilah's hands, trapped inside the heavy blanket, came up and pressed flat against his chest. She kissed him back. She was not the troubled girl being claimed. She was his partner, meeting him halfway. The kiss deepened. It was a promise. It was the sealing of the partnership. His blanket fell from his shoulders to the floor. His hands, no longer gentle, went around her, pulling her against him. He held her tight, his hands spreading wide across her back, lifting her onto her toes. Her hands came free of the blanket and went up to his shoulders. She clutched him, her fingers digging into the hard, dense muscle. It was not the puffed-up muscle of a saloon brawler. It was the solid, unyielding strength of a man who built fences, who dug graves, who hauled water. It was real. It was earned. They stayed like that, locked together. Her heart was hammering against his, their rhythms matching. A single, frantic beat in the warm, dry barn. When the kiss finally broke, they were both breathless. He did not let her go. She did not move away. She rested her head on his chest, right over his heart, listening to it thunder. He buried his face in her damp, tangled hair, breathing her in. The rain on the roof was a curtain, hiding them from the world. It was washing the town clean. It was washing them clean. He held her away, his hands on her upper arms, just enough to look at her. His gray eyes were dark, no longer winter, but the color of the storm. "Stay," he whispered. It was not a question. It was not a command. It was the simplest, most profound plea he had ever made. "Stay in the cabin. Stay as my partner. Stay." Delilah looked up at this silent, broken, powerful man who had seen her the real her from the very beginning. "I am home," she whispered. He pulled her back, his arm sliding around her waist, holding her against his side. He retrieved her blanket from the floor and draped it over both their shoulders. A shared cocoon. The lantern, hanging from its hook, swayed gently in a draft from the door. It cast a single, large shadow of the two of them, merged as one, against the warm, golden hay. Outside, the rain, which had been a violent roar, softened. It was a steady, rhythmic drumming, a lullaby, promising a new, clean world in the morning. The rain that broke the drought was the beginning of the end for Ephraim Calder. The investigation, which had been a slow, bureaucratic grind, was now fueled by the town's gratitude and anger, armed with Prudence Banner's original, damning receipts, and the full, fussy cooperation of Harlan Yates. Judge Dorn was methodical. It was not a trial of passion. It was an audit. Calder was convicted not by a shouting witness, but by the quiet, undeniable testimony of an ink blot. He was found guilty of 6 counts of embezzlement of public funds, conspiracy, and graft. Voss, his forgery laid bare, was convicted alongside him. The town's fury had been spent in the depot. What remained was a cold, quiet justice. Calder's assets were seized by the county and auctioned to repay the road and bridge fund he had pillaged. He was sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. Voss, stripped of his badge and his power, was sentenced to 3. The reign of the quiet squeeze was over. But the town was still thirsty. They gathered again, 2 weeks later, in the same depot. The air was different, the heat was gone, and the mood was not one of anger, but of cautious construction. The aqueduct idea was not the problem, Judge Dorn said, his voice echoing in the hall. The theft was the problem. We still need water. Martha Ellery, whose cattle had provided the crucial distraction, stood up. Then we build it, not Calder, us. A murmur of agreement, a cooperative. But the problem remained. Where would the holding tank go? Holden Pike, who had been standing in the back, stepped forward. He walked to the map, the one Calder had used. He pointed, not to the center of his pasture, but to a high, rocky corner of his land, the one closest to town. "Here," he said. The room went silent. "This corner," Holden said, his voice quiet. "It is high ground, solid rock. I will donate it to the cooperative. For the tank." Judge Dorn stared. "Mr. Pike, that is a generous offer." "It is a practical one," Holden said flatly. "I am tired of hauling barrels." A vote was called. The Sagebrush Water Cooperative was formed, and then a new motion.
We need a treasurer, Martha Ellery said, looking pointedly at the front row.
Someone who knows ledgers. Someone who has already proven they can manage a public fund under pressure.
Every eye in the room turned to Delilah. She was sitting next to her aunt, who was bundled in blankets, looking alert for the first time in a year. Delilah's face flushed.
I nominate Delilah Quinn as treasurer,
Martha said. It was seconded. The vote was unanimous. The woman who had been shamed for a $2 debt was now in charge of the entire town's future. The next day, in the center of town, a small column of smoke rose, Prudence Banner, her face as impassive as stone, stood over a burning trash barrel, one by one. She was feeding the pages of her small, black ledger into the flames. The book that had held the town in chains of shame turned to gray ash and drifted away on the clean wind. When the fire was out, she went inside the trading post. She took down the old, fly-specked sign that advertised tobacco. She replaced it with a new one, the paint still wet. This establishment no longer sells debt. Fair price. Cash only. Her reformation was practical, not sentimental, but it was real. Delilah's own work began. She did not just take over the co-op's books. She took over the town's. She started a class, held 2 nights a week in the back room of Prudence's store, which was now offered for free. Her students were the women, Martha Ellery, the saloon girls, the weary wives from Mesquite Hollow. She taught them reading, but she did not use the Bible. She used a ledger. "This is a column for what you earn," she would say, her charcoal pencil scratching on a large piece of butcher paper. "This is a column for what you spend. This number, this is what you are worth. It is not what Mr. Calder said. It is not what your husband says. It is what the numbers say." She taught them the arithmetic of survival. She taught them to read a loan document. She taught them the grammar of the word no. She was not just teaching literacy. She was distributing armor. Up at Blue Willow Ranch, life was also being rebuilt. The cabin now held Delilah and her aunt. Holden remained in the barn, but he was no longer just a neighbor. He was a partner. He spent a week on a new project. The old, sagging gate to the ranch, which had always hung crooked, was torn down. He built a new one, of solid, clean-smelling cedar. It swung true on new iron hinges, and on the wide crossbeam at the top, he spent an entire afternoon with his knife. He was not a man of letters, but he carved the only words that mattered. He carved the ranch's new creed, the words he had first whispered in the store. The words that had become her battle cry. Nobody is a bill to be settled. In town, the old guard faded. Amos Crow, his one desperate plea for relevance denied, could no longer bear the sight of the woman he had discarded. He could not stand her quiet strength, or the way the town now looked to her for guidance. He took the eastbound stage one Tuesday, telling no one, and was not seen again. That next Sunday, Reverend Crow stood in his pulpit. The roof still leaked. There would be no new stained glass. His congregation looked at him, their faces not angry, but waiting. He did not open his Bible. I have failed this town," he said, his voice thick, breaking. "I was a shepherd who, in his greed for a new fold, let the wolves among you. I traded my silence for the promise of lumber. I valued my position over my conscience. I ask this community for forgiveness." He bowed his head, a broken man. As he stood there, the noon bell in the tower began to ring, pulled by the sexton. Delilah was walking past. On her way to the co-op meeting, she stopped. She heard the same sound that had, for years, rung out the word Baron, Baron. She listened. It was just a bell, a piece of bronze, struck by a hammer. It had no voice. It had no judgment. It was just a note, ringing in the clean, cool air. The curse was gone. She put her hand on the courthouse wall, on the carving that said nobody is useless in the wind, and, for the first time, she smiled at the sound. Time passed. The rain had been a promise. and the earth kept it. The spring came, and with it, Holden and Delilah rode the buckboard, not for water, but for saplings. They planted them, as she had dreamed, in the rich dark soil by the creek. Now, it was late summer, the first crop. The plum trees were small, barely more than switches, but they were defiant. They were laden with fruit. The branches bent low, the small, purple orbs glowing in the afternoon light. Life had returned. Aunt Elspeth, her pain eased, sat on the porch in a new rocking chair, her hands busy knitting. The children from the hollow, their cheeks now round and brown from the sun, were no longer afraid of the ranch. They played tag in the yard, their laughter high and bright, stopping to steal the ripe, warm plums directly from the trees. Delilah came out of the cabin, her hands dusted with flour, carrying a pie. The children cheered. She set it on the railing to cool. She walked, past the new gate, to the fence line where Holden was standing. He was not working. He was just watching the children play, watching his land, green and alive. She stood beside him. They did not speak for a long time. The silence between them was as deep and comfortable as the valley itself. He turned to her. The gray in his eyes was gone. They were the color of the clear blue sky after a storm. He reached out and took her hand. It was not the grasping, desperate hold from the depot. It was not the tentative, questioning touch from the night on the porch. It was a simple, solid, confident grasp, his calloused fingers interlaced with hers. He looked at her face, at the woman who had rebuilt his life and her own, all with a ledger and a backbone of steel. He leaned in, and he whispered, the same low rumble she had heard in the trading post so long ago. But the words were different. They were the final, balanced entry in their ledger. You are not a debt, Delilah, he whispered. You are home. He lifted her hand to his lips. The sun began to set. A light mist, born of the full creek and the new co-op tank, rose in the valley. On the post of the new cedar gate, beneath the carved words, hung 2 hats, his a wide-brimmed, sweat-stained Stetson, and beside it, her simple, straw garden hat. In the far distance, on the hill he had given them, the new, riveted steel water tank, full and solid, caught the last ray of the setting sun. It shone, bright and silver. A promise kept. The town and their hearts were finally full. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to hear from you. So please comment below and let us know where you are listening from. Share your thoughts, and let's connect. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story in this video can be heard by more people.